Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Will Discussion with Agent Smith. Today is August the 15th, 2021. And we're going to try to figure out what is going on in the world. I'm joined by none other than my friend, Agent Smith.
Hello.
What's up, dude?
Hey, how are you?
Pretty good. I've had an interesting week. Had some unique challenges, but I've survived them. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. Can't complain.
But you could.
Oh yeah, always. I did take that walk.
You did!
Yeah, I did.
Praise God!
It didn't end up being for 30 minutes though.
Well, I said 20.
Oh, 20? Okay.
How many was it?
It ended up being just 10. I just kind of walked around the block.
Ladies and gentlemen, I formally issue all of you the Agent Smith Challenge. A lot of people, they've been indoorsy with the COVID, or they're indoorsy before then, whatever. Walking is good for your health. I challenge you all to match Agent Smith's 10-minute walk this week. If you do a 10-minute walk, let me know, and I'll give you a high five. Good job, dude. That's infinitely better than the last time I asked you about going for a walk.
That's true.
It's going to be hard to keep up the infinity gains, though, for next week.
Yeah. Yeah, as I'm always concerned about human interaction.
Mm-hmm.
I would rather just be able to go do that without having to deal with people.
In Texas, people are more keen to like engage with you, like say hi and start talking to you. In Seattle, a lot of times they don't make eye contact and they don't acknowledge that you exist.
My kind of place.
Yeah. So that'd probably be more comfortable.
Yeah, I figured Sunday morning would be a good time for it. Because I figured people were either at church or sleeping in. As was, I didn't make it 30 steps out of the house before a neighbor saw me and asked me to walk their dog every other day in perpetuity, basically.
Wow. You see that? Finding a job is easy. Just go outside. People ask you to walk their dog.
Yeah, I thought it was strange because that's the first time I've walked that particular dog.
Mm-hmm.
So they had never seen me do that before. So the first thing they do, the first time they see me doing it, is to ask me to walk their dog.
Oh, were you walking a family dog?
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
Yeah.
So
Let me move this over here.
I had a tournament and things yesterday. Thanks for being patient with the analysis of those matches.
No problem.
It was a really fun invitational. I felt like I played pretty well overall. I got so close to winning that it's like in that uncanny valley area where you didn't win. You did as close as you could to first place, but that makes it more frustrating than being in third place where you're a little bit further off. You didn't feel like you were almost tasting victory, but it was a best of 5 finals and it was tied up 2-2 and I lost the last game. So that was a little bit of a frustrating thing. So I went and I took a walk and ran for a bit too. And the sun, when it was setting, was red. It was pretty spooky, but it's from the smoke of the forest fires.
Lots of ominous signs these days.
Yep. It's been a very turbulent period.
Unfortunately, so.
So there's one huge ticket item for today. Can you guess what it is? Some weeks we kind of walk into Agent Smith like, all right, what do you want to do? Africa, China? What? For this one, ever since I like first turned on the stream, people were like, is Agent Smith gonna come on? Did you see Afghanistan? What's happening? So for those who have not kept tabs with the news, huge moves have been happening in Afghanistan. There were some clues ahead of time, like the American embassy, they were burning documents and trying to get people out and stuff like that. But I try to give a brief big picture on what we've talked about before with regards to the Middle East and how whenever you pull out a military force like the U.S. pulls out of Iraq, there's a power vacuum. ISIS comes in, they sweep a bunch of territory because there isn't the military presence there anymore. Similarly, we recently pulled out of Afghanistan. Power vacuum. What's going to happen? Well, this happened. So,
Yeah.
What happened?
I mean, that's pretty much the gist of it. The Taliban never went away, really. I mean, after the US invasion in 2001, they pretty much just hid out in Pakistan. And, there was a good couple of years where they were very dysfunctional and they had very little organizational integrity remaining. So during that time period, the US kind of had its way as far as organizing Afghanistan in its own sort of self-image. But starting around 2005, the Taliban started rebuilding. And that led up to Obama's surge around 2009, 2010, whenever that was. Uh, at that point, the US kind of was looking to get out, but didn't really know how to do it. So the surge was kind of a conciliatory gesture, you might say, by the Obama administration to the military, which of course didn't want to leave. Because, of course, the military is concerned about the implications of withdrawing from Afghanistan, that being that transnational terrorists could set up shop there again.
Mm.
So Biden, who was vice president at that time, actually wanted to pull out completely at the time because he didn't think there was any point in staying. The mission was already aimless, and there was no clear path to victory. There wasn't even really a notion at the time of what victory would look like. We were pretty much just there so that Al Qaeda would not be. But that was such an ambiguous goal, which could be pursued in so many different ways, that nobody really knew how to operationalize it.
Well, to put it in some kind of game terms, it seemed like by the U.S. still being in Afghanistan, it maintained a stalemate where Al Qaeda, the Taliban, they couldn't push for territory freely, but at the same time, there wasn't enough American involvement that they could push and get the Taliban out. So they're basically maintaining that stalemate position, and then when they leave, the stalemate is broken, and then they have freedom on the map. I think some people were saying that the U.S. thought that the Afghan military could defend against that, but clearly not.
Yeah, there was a hope. That's kind of what I was talking about the last time you brought this up,
Mm-hmm.
But that's getting a little bit ahead of myself. In 2009, that was when the surge happened. The Obama administration wanted to get out, but ultimately did not. Again, there was a debate within the administration, and so they figured, let's do a surge and try to break the deadlock, and maybe then we'll make enough gains that we can kind of pull out, and there will be a stable equilibrium after we leave.
Mm.
But after several years of fighting, that didn't really happen. And after a while, they started to reach out to the Taliban for peace talks. So that started late in the Obama administration and then was continued by the Trump administration. And obviously, that led in 2020 to the declaration by the US that we were going to pull out, which we started to do nominally. But ultimately, it fell to the Biden administration to kind of really implement that. And the Biden administration was of the mind that the Afghan Army was at a stage where it could probably at least maintain something resembling a stalemate. They would probably lose some territory. But the expectation is that the Afghan Army was large enough and that popular support against the Taliban, at least, maybe not so much for the government, but at least popular dislike for the Taliban would be sufficient to keep the Taliban out of the cities. So that was the expectation. The government would hold the cities, the Taliban would hold the rural areas, and then there would be some kind of peace negotiation in which they would share power. It was thought that that's what it would look like once the US pulled out, and that's just been wrong. I mean, we last talked about this, I think, 3 weeks ago. Is that about right?
Mm-hmm.
And the situation on the ground has changed radically. I don't know how much of it you've been following.
Not a ton. I've seen some of the maps that were posted of what territory the Taliban holds, but the tricky thing there is it was changing very rapidly. So people would post a map and it's like, this is the territory they have as of X date and X hour.
Mm-hmm.
But the moves have been made pretty quick. And that's
Yeah.
maybe something that is in common with the advancement of ISIS, which is if you don't have heavy defense in an area, then an attacker can move through and take some pretty large swaths of territory rather fast.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what they were doing at first. They were moving through areas in which, rural areas in which there was relatively little government presence and not much will to resist them. So I think the data point I have here from early July is that between May and early July, 50 of 370 districts in Afghanistan fell to the Taliban. And they also seized control of the entire province of Kunduz, along with the capital, also called Kunduz. I apologize if I'm getting the pronunciations wrong. So these rural outposts were the first to go, and districts started falling pretty quickly in that regard. And they focused on rural areas, they focused on supply lines, especially the highway, setting up checkpoints and whatnot. And from what I've read, they also tried to disrupt and seize, either disrupt or seize districts that were particular money generators for the government. They also seized a series of border posts. These are just basically entry points into the country from neighboring states. So a whole series of major border crossings were seized roughly over that same time span, roughly June, July, thereabouts. And that was important because those are important generators of revenue also. The government gets a lot of customs revenue from border crossings, so the Taliban wanted to try to deny them that. From there, they basically just kept pushing until they'd surrounded all of the major cities and the major capitals of the districts. And that was kind of where I think analysts sort of expected things to stabilize. And that's roughly where we were the last time we talked 3 weeks ago. And the Afghan army has just collapsed totally. And all of those cities have fallen now. There were no major battles for them. Most of the local garrisons disappeared, and local militias and local warlords just cut deals with the Taliban rather than fight, because they didn't think there was any point in resisting. So instead of this equilibrium between cities and rural areas, we've just seen a total wipeout for the government. And it's been so rapid that the United States government has been caught totally off guard. There was no preparation for this scale of collapse. And right now, as we speak, Kabul is in the process of falling. Kabul is basically the last major territory controlled by the government at this point, and they're not going to keep it. In fact, the president has already resigned his position and has left the country.
What would you say were the military advantages of the Taliban over the Afghan forces? Like you said they were cutting supply lines, so it's hard to reinforce given locations as they're moving through.
So the major advantage that the Taliban had is that they were very decentralized. The critical mistake I think that the United States made in Afghanistan, just based on what I've been reading, is that we tried to build a centralized state in Afghanistan, and that was just never going to work. The country in its history has never had a centralized state that has worked and been legitimate. The only other real period of history in which there was a real centralized state was when the Soviets were there, and we all saw how that went. So it's just not effective. The political economy in Afghanistan is such that local regional power brokers are the ones who run their local area, and if you try to force a centralized state on them, then they resist you. They either resist you with force, as with the Taliban and other warlords that are fighting the government, or they buy into your government and then corrupt it from the inside out, wherein they basically maintain their power under the sort of guise of recognizing your authority. So that's been the problem with the Afghan state from the start. Nobody really respected its authority, up to and including the people who worked in it. And that meant that the government's ability to impose its writ, that is to say, impose its monopoly on violence, was severely undermined. So there's never been a point in the Afghan state's history when it's been able to centralize the whole country under its rule. It's pretty much always been very decentralized. And because the United States refused to recognize that and build a development strategy around that for its state building project in Afghanistan. It's pretty much just been doomed from the start. Now, to be fair to the United States, part of the reason we did that is because we didn't want to work with the warlords. I remember way back in like 2002, there was some discussion about allying with local warlords and whatnot, and they didn't want to do that because they didn't have any legitimacy. One of the Taliban's claims to legitimacy when they were in control of the country in the 90s is that they got rid of the warlords, or at least fought them, pushed them out. And obviously it's debatable just how much of a improvement that was, given all the things the Taliban did. In some cases they weren't all that different than the warlords. It was enough of an improvement, at least a noticeable improvement, that people were willing to tolerate them in a lot of cases. So the United States didn't want to ally with warlords for that reason. They wanted to create a state that was sort of in the Western mold that could maintain legitimacy in the eyes of the public, but it never could. It was just unfeasible without the support of local power brokers. And so those guys basically just totally destroyed the government's ability to deliver. And it didn't help that the government itself undermined its, what limited steps it took to try to win legitimacy, like providing healthcare, education, whatnot. A lot of that was undermined by the corruption of the warlords that bought into the government, and by, even high-level officials in the government itself, like Ghani, or, what's his name? Hamid Karzai, the first president of the republic. All of these guys kind of took the attitude that a certain degree of corruption was either necessary or at least acceptable. And so huge amounts of money were just pilfered from major institutions, such that those institutions were never really viable.
One thing that we talked about with regard to Iraq and the U.S. moving in, like, yeah, you can go in and maybe have a decisive military victory, but one thing that is more of a glacial change is norms. So we're talking about the norms of like faith and institutions. In Afghanistan, do they say, hey, we just established an institution. Is this something that we can trust? Their instinct historically would be, no, we cannot trust this institution. I'm going to trust the local guy in town who actually has some muscle and some firepower, where if I run into a problem, I'm going to go to him instead of relying on the government. So just because like a modern democratic government rolls in, it doesn't mean that they can just leave and then they're going to say, okay, now we're going to run the show like you would want us to. They're going to go back to what they were doing before, basically.
Yeah, and that's pretty much what's happening now. You can kind of consider the past 20 years a Western bubble in Afghan history that had a big effect on Afghanistan in a number of ways, but which could never survive without American backing. And now that that's gone, the bubble is imploding, and Afghanistan is returning to mean, as it were. I can see that you're in a game here, so I don't expect you to look at these right now, but I'll post you some links that kind of illustrate some pictures and video of what's happening at the moment. Because right now, there's a lot of panic in Kabul, because there's a lot of people who worked for the government and fought against the Taliban, who obviously are terrified of what the Taliban will do to them if they get their hands on them. And there's a massive rush to get to the international airport and get out of the country. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of dramatic images there. I'll stick that in the Discord here.
Cool.
Okay. There we go. So yeah, 10 district capitals fell in about 10 weeks. And that was just incredible. The past couple weeks in particular have just been wild. It's just been one disaster after the other for the ANA. It just feels inevitable. It just kind of felt inevitable over the course of the past 3 weeks that the government would collapse. Let's see, so talking about today, so the Taliban initially said that they weren't going to harass U.S. forces who were evacuating people from Kabul. And for the most part, they've held to that. They also said that they wouldn't enter Kabul until the U.S. was gone. They don't particularly like the U.S., but They're quite willing to allow the U.S. to leave of its own accord, which, is what they're doing anyway. So no need to make for a huge battle of Kabul when your major opponent is in the process of leaving.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of a very polite pullout in that sense, at least thus far. It probably helps that the U.S. actually rushed something like an entire brigade to the airport in the past couple days. I suspect that the U.S. kind of knew what was coming, and so the Biden administration seems to have sent some guarantee. Wanted to have basically a guarantee that the Taliban would not just rush the capital and seize it and prevent the U.S. from evacuating embassy staff and other people. So there is several thousand U.S. troops now in and around the airport. So I suspect that the U.S. will be able to carry out its evacuation unmolested for the most part. Mm-hmm. But it's making, again, for some drama in the interim. The Biden administration, specifically Joe Biden himself, went on TV not too long ago, I think like a week or two ago, and was saying that, there's no way that, it's going to be Saigon again. There's not going to be helicopters, evacuating people from embassies again. And that's exactly what's happening today.
Heck.
You can see, the pictures, the video, and whatnot. It's, just the speed of the collapse has just shocked everybody. And so the U.S. has been forced into these dramatic measures to try to get everybody out as quickly as possible. Let's see. Oh, here's another one. There's images of the Taliban in the presidential palace to give you an idea. They said that they weren't going to enter Kabul at first, but they noted that the Afghan army had collapsed, and so they said that they were going to enter Kabul anyway, because there just wasn't, there's basically nobody to stop them. So they're just sort of establishing control, again, as we speak.
So I have the footage from the Afghanistan military training.
Yeah, that was something somebody posted on Reddit.
They're doing
I don't know
jacks.
I don't know how representative that is, but in general, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that the Afghan army was not particularly well trained.
They can't even do jumping jacks at the same time.
Yeah, they had some trouble there.
I'm in.
Let's see. Now, the Taliban setting up interim government, that's pretty much what you would expect. The President Ghani, before he resigned, was talking about negotiating with the Taliban. He had been doing that, on and off for the past several months. Now, though, it seems the Taliban have nobody to negotiate with. So they're pretty much just setting up their own state at this point.
So this is the airport. Just tons of people on the tarmac trying to get on planes. I'm guessing they're not doing their normal bag check stuff that they would do. Oh, crap.
Yeah, it's a big rush. Yeah, there was also some video on Reddit of, what was it? Oh, the traffic jam to the airport, on the road to the airport. It didn't look like it was moving. I suspect people had to get out and walk. Let's see what we have. I mean, that's pretty much been what's been happening for the past couple months. I think that's a pretty decent summary. Just to give you an idea of why it was expected that the Afghan army would be able to hold up. For one, there's precedent. When the Soviets evacuated Afghanistan, their puppet government was able to hold out for 2 years, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there was some well, it was just kind of expected that this government would be similar, that they would at least be able to hold out for a bit longer, even if the U.S. wasn't explicitly backing them anymore.
So a question that I had here is, for the people who are evacuating, how do they decide, okay, I'm fine with the Taliban becoming the new government, or I'm not? Because clearly a lot of people are wanting to leave. What happens if they stay versus if they go?
So that's kind of the million-dollar question right now. I mean, what are the Taliban going to do now that they're back in control? And nobody really has an answer to that. It's not clear just what plans they have for the country. It's broadly assumed that they're going to reestablish Sharia law in the country, but just how draconian that ends up being isn't really clear. They're saying that they're going to be nicer, basically. They've told their troops not to go and what's the phrase I want? They've basically banned their troops from engaging in revenge killing.
Hmm.
Although I kind of suspect that's more for Kabul than anything, more for the capital.
Yeah,
But
if you
other
want to
than,
establish yourself as a legit government, you don't want to make too severe a mess of things. Say anytime there's war, there's going to be collateral damage, and you're going to have some bad apples in the bunch who, even if you say don't do this, they'll do it anyway because they can.
yeah,
But yeah, it seemed like the Afghan military, they weren't really selected as the cream of the crop, and they weren't super well trained, and experience is a really big factor in just military competence. The first time that you're operating a rifle in the field of battle is not going to be your best, just because maybe you've practiced on a range a few times, but you don't have the practical experience of you've been able to operate your weapon when it's noisy and scary and you're afraid for your life. Whereas
yeah.
I would guess more people who are fighting on the Taliban side of things, they've had a lot of those real world skirmishes and encounters where they know that they have the upper hand of experience as well. And then they also have momentum of morale. Like they're fighting for something that they believe to be better for the country. So they have that edge of passion as well and motivation.
There's some truth to that, but it's not the full picture. And if you want to talk about the ANA and the Taliban, we can get into that now because I've got notes for that as well.
Sure.
Um, so the problem with your assessment, again, it's partially right, but the issue is that it kind of implicitly argues that the Afghan army and the Taliban are sort of monolithic institutions, and they're not. The Taliban, for their part, are heavily factionalized. They have a whole bunch of different components to them. It's basically a broad coalition of different groups that are roughly working together towards a common goal. But beyond that, there's not a whole lot of hierarchy to their organization. Obviously, there's the Quetta Taliban, which is basically Taliban Central. That's the main backbone of the organization. That's sort of the residual institution left over from the Taliban state in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And there's, significant continuity between the two institutions. So that is sort of what people think of and refer to when they talk about the Taliban. But there's also groups like the Haqqani Network, which is sort of a network of militants left over from the Soviet war back in the 1980s. They're allied with the Taliban and basically, fight under their banner, but they're their own group, their own set of networks. There used to be a guy called Hekmatyar, a warlord. He was the sort of the third major leg of the Taliban's coalition, but he ended up cutting a deal with the government, I think, a year or two ago. Probably regretting that a little bit at this point, but so it goes. So those are the three, or were the three major, components of the coalition. But there's also kind of a de facto fourth leg of the coalition, which was and is the local franchises. There's a lot of local warlords and local militant bands, and also basically what amounts to bandit groups that engage in violent activity, nominally under the control of the Taliban, but in effect autonomous. And these are the guys that make up probably the bulk of the Taliban's fighting force. So when we talk about the Taliban launching an offensive and doing this, that, or the other, there's some coordination between these different groups, but not necessarily a lot. A lot of them basically work by themselves, raise revenue by themselves, and kind of do their own thing. The degree of control by the Taliban is highly debatable. And that's actually one of the major open questions going forward, is the degree to which the Taliban can actually centralize its control of the country now that it's basically taken it back. If they can maintain all of these coalitions, then they should be able to govern the country without too much of a problem. But if one or the other major group within the coalition decides to break away or to use violence to try to improve its position, there could be significant political violence or even a civil war. Basically an intra-Taliban civil war. It's not entirely clear, again, whether or not that's going to happen because we just don't know enough about the nature of all these networks. But it's definitely not homogenous. It is not a particularly strong centralized institution, such that we can say that they've decisively seized control of the country and will now just rule it with an iron fist. So the Afghan army is similar. The Afghan army is a central institution, sort of like we would think of a Western army, but in practice, it's very weak, or at least it was very weak before it liquidated. So to kind of go through some of the problems here with the ANA, one of the problems is ghost soldiers. We've talked about this before. This is basically where an officer responsible for paying, soldiers will basically log fake soldiers in the paperwork and will embezzle the pay that is supposed to go to those fake soldiers. So as a result, a significant amount of money that was supposed to go towards the payroll of the Afghan army ended up getting pilfered by corrupt actors in this vein, by lying about people who were on the payroll who really weren't. Another problem is that even among some of the soldiers who actually did exist, sometimes their pay was withheld, also by corrupt officers, with the result that a lot of people just weren't paid on time and sometimes ever. One of the data points I have here somewhere is that Afghan police officers, Afghan police are controlled by the Ministry of Security, basically by the army. So it's all sort of one big institution. So police in Afghanistan haven't been paid in months. There's been no money for them. So not really that much of a shock that a lot of them stopped turning up for work.
Mm-hmm.
Another problem with the ANA, they're not localized. Kind of like what I was talking about before. In Afghanistan, the political culture is very decentralized. And as a result, if you want to do anything, you have to use local power brokers. And the Afghan army didn't do that. They tried to sort of create an army in the Western vein where you take people from all parts of the country and create a common identity and have them fight together towards a common purpose. But that just wasn't going to work, for the aforementioned reasons. So as a result, a lot of the garrisons around Afghanistan were manned by people who had no connections to the local area they were fighting in. And as a result, they didn't feel particularly compelled to try very hard in order to fight for the people there. All the more so because some of the people there did not particularly like the national government and especially did not like the behavior of some of the Afghan soldiers. That's something else I'll get to later. But the lack of local actors exploited to help provide local security meant that the Afghan army was sufficiently undermined. The Taliban did do this. That is to say, they did operate with local actors. That's sort of the local franchises I mentioned. The local bandit gangs, the local warlords, these kinds of people were the sorts of local power brokers that the Taliban were happy to work with if they were willing to nominally declare their loyalty towards the Taliban. And so as a result, the Taliban pretty much almost always had hometown advantage at a local level because they were always using local fighters, whereas the Afghan army was almost always using fighters who were not from the local area. Another problem was supplies. So the logistics of the Afghan army are super corrupt. It was very common for people to just steal from the Afghan army's logistical chain and sell stuff on the black market. And as a result, the Afghan army was frequently short of things like food and ammunition, both of which are pretty helpful to keeping an army in the field. So again, not too much of a surprise here that the Afghan army is underperforming. Hungry soldiers without ammunition and without pay do not generally make for good soldiers. Another problem here, the Afghan Air Force was supposed to be a major trump card for the Afghan military. And that was something the U.S. kind of really focused on over the past 20 years so that they could ensure the long-term viability of the Afghan state. But they did not prepare them very well for maintaining aircraft. A lot of the maintenance for the aircraft was being done by contractors whom were being paid by the United States government. And that was workable even though the U.S. had technically semi-pulled out of Afghanistan a couple of years ago. The most recent pullout is the actual pullout, but technically we quote unquote drew down, years ago in order to minimize our presence. So our presence after that was mostly air support, logistical support, and intelligence support, which did require the presence of some American assets, but it was significantly fewer than there had been before when there were actual ground troops deployed in Afghanistan. That is to say, regulars as opposed to special forces, which were operating even after the drawdown. So long as the United States maintained sort of that drawn down presence in Afghanistan, it was viable for the contractors to be there because the United States could provide security for them. But after the U.S. pulled out in the past couple months, the country was no longer sufficiently secure for those contractors to stay, and so they actually left. And as a result, there wasn't anybody to maintain the air assets that the Afghan Air Force had. And that was a significant inhibitor for the Afghan military's ability to continue to fight against the Taliban, since, again, air support was one of their big advantages. Another big problem here, discipline. So I think there was a documentary called Restrepo. I remember I've seen a couple documentaries about Afghanistan, but one of the famous ones was Restrepo. And, in that, one of the Special Forces advisors that the U.S. sent was interviewed by the documentarian. And, he noted that the guy that he was advising at a local level, one of the district officers was actually a pedophile. In Afghanistan, there's this weird cultural thing, I'm not even sure what to call it, where older men will sometimes have sex with younger boys. Often the boys are dancers, and they kind of circulate around the country as dancers, but really they're basically just young male prostitutes. And this is a very unpopular, cultural institution in Afghanistan, but it's persevered for a very long time. It's thought to be very old, so it's just one of those things that nobody can quite stamp out, even though nobody really likes it very much. So this district officer was one of these guys, and you could tell the American advisor was super uncomfortable about it. He really didn't appreciate it.
Yeah,
and a lot of the local...
Chad's saying very Roman. There are other examples of this kind of tradition, I think, in other countries historically. In Japan as well, it was kind of a bit of a thing. And we were talking some about traditions this past week and how some traditions are just kind of passed down from one generation to the next, and some people just accept it as like, oh, well, the elder generation did this, so I'll agree with going along with it as well. And some of the traditions are like really fucked up. If you think about the ethics of the situation to a lot of our more modern sensibilities, that is fucked up. They're not to the age of consent, so that shouldn't be allowed. But if it's been happening in this region for a really long time, it's just status quo.
As a side note, related to this, there was some playwright, I guess in New York, who wrote a play about one of these young boys who was sort of stuck in this position as a de facto male prostitute. And he got in a bunch of trouble over it because he kind of tried to romanticize it a little bit.
Oh, yeah. Like there was an upside or something?
I don't know about that, but I think he was kind of meant to try to celebrate LGBTQ, sort of the culture there.
Mm-hmm.
I suspect it was more finesse than that, because you know how the internet is with the clickbait headlines. But yeah, there was a big brouhaha about it, and he ended up having to basically pull the play. Yeah, just random trivia for you as far as that particular custom goes. There we go, custom. That's the word I was looking for. Also, another side note here, I've read somewhere that the custom might actually be related to ancient Greeks. So it's kind of funny somebody mentions that it sounds Roman. There actually were a number of Greeks who made it to Afghanistan as part of Alexander the Great's invasions of the region. And in fact, I think Kandahar was originally named Alexandria, if I'm not mistaken, or at least one of the major cities over there was. I think it's Kandahar. So it was founded as Alexandria, named after Alexander, and it was originally settled by a number of Greeks whom stuck around in the country for a long time. So there's a theory that maybe this custom that we're talking about may actually have been introduced by ancient Greeks who came to Afghanistan thousands of years ago. But it's kind of hard to prove, so, anybody's guess. But interesting trivia anyway.
Yeah, but so far from what you've said, regarding the Afghan military. It seems like it was completely dysfunctional. Like, yeah, they on paper may have had some supposed tech advantages, but if each of the institutions has leaks in it, like it's kind of like Afghan military, maybe it's a boat that has some good guns on it, but it's got huge leaks in the bottom of the hull of money, supplies, ammunition. So no department of it is going to be able to thrive or succeed or be even remotely close to a good match. It seemed like the swing vote here was the warlords. Who is willing to work with the warlords and use their military ability for the conflict? The government and the U.S. said, no, we're not going to work with these people, but they still have fighting capability. So if you won't take them, then the opposition will, kind of a thing.
Well, I'm going to talk about that in a minute because one of the problems the Afghan army had was its strategy and, well, strategy and leadership. And one of the problems they had is that President Ghani was a notorious micromanager.
Mm.
So he had a number of warlords in his coalition. And, a lot of them were disarmed because the United States, again, didn't like warlords and tried to push them to recognize the authority of the government and to abandon militarism. And that was partly successful. But, when the Taliban started to resurge, it would have been quite possible for Ghani to kind of devolve some power to the warlords and allow them to arm up and maybe participate more in the provision of security to the country, or, well, basically fight the Taliban. But he never did that. He just tried to centralize all of the power into the central government and just did not really cooperate well with other people in his coalition. So that was another major reason why the Afghan army and the Afghan government were not able to build legitimacy and otherwise become an effective institution. Micromanager, nobody likes a micromanager, but it was especially problematic here where the state was really struggling to build popular support. And, the fact that he was just unable to cooperate with the major actors in his coalition meant that the government's efforts were hobbled.
There's a overlap in theme that I'm seeing with Germany and World War II and focusing, I guess, the leader making military decisions that generals should be making. So if you're elected president, prime minister, whatever, you're in some very high government position, you're not going to have as much field experience as a general will. You're not going to know exactly quite as well the training and the effectiveness of the troops. You're not going to know the lay of the land as well, and you're not going to know as many tactics. So whenever you have that top down of someone with a whole bunch of power suddenly backseat generaling for other people in the military who should be making those decisions, it usually goes badly.
Yeah, I mean that's pretty much what happened to a degree anyway. I mean, I think in Afghanistan's case, it's not a perfect analogy because they didn't really have the best generals. A lot of the generals were political appointees or politically connected people, as opposed to necessarily the most effective fighters.
Mm-hmm.
One of the events that happened in the past week is that roughly a week ago, the president removed the lead, the top general in the country from his position. He basically fired him because the Afghan army was just not performing. So yes, you're right that there was some political interference in the war fighting, but also part of the problem is that he did not allow warlords to kind of participate.
Mm-hmm.
There was some discussion on Foreign Policy Mag, in one of the articles that, it seems interesting now to think about it, but the article argued that it wasn't inevitable that the Afghan state would collapse and that it actually, there was reason to think that it could last. So it's a little, ironic given what's happened over the past couple of weeks. But one of the arguments made is that, President Ghani could enlist these warlords. But even in that article, which was trying to make this argument, it was noted that the warlords themselves believed that President Ghani would not do that because he would not be willing to share power. And the warlords all noted that there just hadn't been any discussions from the central government about doing anything like that, and that they had no idea what the government was going to do going forward. So even at that stage, it seemed like there was no solid leadership on how to deal with this Taliban problem that was emerging in the wake of the U.S. pullout.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. So I talked about discipline, so just a couple more here about the Afghan army. Another problem was infiltration. The Taliban found it really easy to get guys into the Afghan army. So there was a lot of intelligence that the Taliban were able to acquire just from people that had infiltrated the army. Uh, it also made for pretty easy blue on blue attacks, which, the Afghan army kind of got to be notorious for. Basically, where U.S. troops embedded with Afghan units would be attacked by people in those units. It wasn't always Taliban that did it. Sometimes somebody perceives an insult or just gets really angry, and that could lead to an attack as well. But some of them were Taliban.
Blue on blue means intentional friendly fire from within the same unit.
Yeah, that's what it means. Another problem, morale. All the things I've mentioned basically play into the collapse of morale in the Afghan army. But there was a couple other things also in the past couple months that played into it. One of them was the U.S. pullout from Bagram Air Base. Did you hear about this?
Mm-mm.
So Bagram Air Base was, anyway, the largest air base in Afghanistan, I believe. And it was sort of the locus, the focal point for U.S. air operations in the country when U.S. air assets were present in the country. And when the Biden administration decided to pull out, they left like overnight, and they did not tell the Afghan government they were leaving. So they pulled out so quickly that the Afghan government wasn't prepared to move in and take responsibility for the facility. They literally left keys in trucks. It was just so quick, and people actually looted the base, the next day because there just wasn't anybody guarding it. And it took the Afghan government some time to mobilize people to go and take custody of the facility. So that kind of illustrated to the Afghan army that the United States wasn't just pulling out, it was abandoning them, basically. It was completely leaving the conflict. Mm-hmm. And that wasn't really entirely true. The U.S. did continue to provide some air support from air assets located outside of Afghanistan, but the scope of that support was much smaller. And it was, obviously, as we can see, insufficient. But the Afghan army's morale took a hit from that. It was kind of a major signal that the United States was no longer going to be their backer, and that they were kind of on their own. And kind of a final point here about the Afghan army, desertions were a big problem. It was pretty normal for the Afghan army to experience significant desertions. I don't have like the data point in front of me, but it was noted that desertion is not actually illegal in Afghanistan, which kind of blew my mind. That seems
you can just like quit like it's a job and you're like, I don't want to do this anymore. Okay.
I guess.
Good luck.
That's what was mentioned in the article. It's not illegal to desert. So no shock then that there was a lot of desertions. That seems like an easy problem to fix. I guess they didn't feel like they could do that without aggravating a significant portion of the population, which itself says a lot if that's true. But yeah, desertions and just lack of personnel were major problems for them as well. So that's a list of problems faced by the Afghan army. And, I just wanted to mention these to kind of illustrate and, provide some context for your comments earlier, talking about the Afghan army and the Taliban. The Afghan army was not like a coherent institution that was fighting and just had some disadvantages that were exploited by an opponent. It was a hollow institution that had very little capacity to act for the reasons exemplified here. Let's see, I had a data point here about something else. No penalty for desertion. Yeah. Oh, here, was this it? Yeah, here we go. So attrition. So I guess this could be another item here about the Afghan army. So the amount of attrition that the Afghan army was facing was pretty significant. They were losing about 5,000 men per month. And that's combined casualties and desertions, basically. And their recruitment was about 300 to 500 a month. So I'm assuming this is roughly data from the past year or so. If that's the case, then that really illustrates how unsustainable the Afghan army was as an institution. They were just bleeding people left and right. Let's see, did you get a chance to look at those videos I sent?
Mm-hmm. All but the last one, I think. Wait, no, you have the Taliban posing. I haven't caught up with those.
Gotcha. Okay. Oh, so okay. So I guess we can move on to strategy then. So what was the Afghan government strategy in the war? So one of the things they wanted to do, and one of the things that the U.S. pushed them to do, was to focus on protecting cities. And one of the criticisms I read over on Small Wars Journal was that this was really dumb because, the Taliban were out in the countryside, so they should have taken the war to them. As was, they played it relatively defensively, which made it relatively easy for the Taliban to build up a base of support. I don't know if that's entirely. I mean, I'm kind of talking out of my ass. Obviously, I don't have military experience, but I kind of wonder about that criticism because one of the things the United States did in Vietnam was explicitly not to focus on the urban areas. They kind of left that to ARVN, the South Vietnamese military. And the U.S. military explicitly focused on rural areas because they wanted to cut off the supply chain between local guerrillas and foreign suppliers, specifically North Vietnam. And they did that very cognizant of the fact that, historically, rebellions and guerrilla fighters generally are much more effective in rural areas, in the sense that they operate more freely and are able to seize a lot of territory, while the status quo power generally holds up in cities. And, often that doesn't end well, since the cities then get cut off and strangulated. So the U.S. did that in Vietnam, and I think we all know how Vietnam ended. It didn't really work. So that's a whole kind of topic in and of itself, but that's what I thought of when I heard people criticizing the focus on cities. Focusing on rural areas doesn't necessarily help either. But in the interest of, full disclosure here, I wanted to try to cover as much as I could. I wanted to include this criticism. Apparently, the Afghan army focused too much on the cities and did not engage in enough offensive operations in rural areas. Another strategy here was that, this isn't so much a strategy, but this is more just like a strategic problem, which is that the Taliban and elements of the Taliban were all funded, or well, at least in large part funded by Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI, the Inter-Services Intelligence Agency. And there was never a solution to that. Like, there was never anything the Afghan army or the United States even could really do about that. They could have brought sanctions, but that could have destabilized Pakistan, and I suspect there was a lot of aversion to destabilizing a state that had a lot of nuclear weapons, which Pakistan does. So if not for that, if not for Pakistan's nukes, they probably would have been sanctioned into oblivion and made to kind of give up their support for the Taliban. But as was, I suspect Washington was too risk averse to do that. So as a result, the Taliban just kind of continually had this drip feed of supplies from the ISI that there wasn't really an answer to. There just wasn't really a way to resolve that. And that significantly empowered the Taliban relative to government forces. That was a major determining factor in the conflict. So that was another strategic problem the Afghan government had. It didn't really have any kind of tools or leverage it could use in order to try to push Pakistan to stop its support for these rebels, for the Taliban. Let's see, we already talked about warlords. That pretty well covered that. Defoliant. I've been playing RimWorld again the past week, so defoliant is kind of in my vocabulary lately.
What does that mean?
That's basically when you spray to destroy crops or plants or what have you. At least that's what I think it means. So one of the problems that the United States faced in Afghanistan, as well as the Afghan government, was the opium problem. We didn't really want people to be growing opium because we knew the Taliban were taxing it. And so we tried to discourage its use, but the problem was it was very lucrative and a lot of people made a lot of money off of it, so they kind of wanted to anyway. What a lot of people would say is that they didn't want, when I say people, I mean farmers in Afghanistan. What a lot of farmers would say is that they didn't want to grow opium, but in some cases the Taliban made them. But even when the Taliban was not making them, it was too lucrative to pass up. They were all just so poor that producing a cash crop like that, which in effect is what opium is, was just irresistible. So what they wanted was for the Afghan government, rather, to provide them with some kind of subsidies in order to make other alternative crops, more attractive. But of course, as we've discussed, the Afghan government's capacity was very limited, so that was never really going to happen. So as a result, there was a lot of opium growing, and the catch-22 was that if we burn these crops, or spray them, or do whatever, then a lot of these people are just even more impoverished than they were anyway. And if your crop fails in Afghanistan, one of the things you do, kind of like farmers throughout history, is that you go and find another job. And one of the big jobs in Afghanistan is soldier. And the Taliban are quite happy to pay people to fight for them. They don't require you necessarily to be an ideologically devoted follower. They'll use mercenaries like anybody else. So a lot of farmers, when in the cases where, this was done, where crops were destroyed, a lot of farmers would just go and basically fight for pay for the Taliban. So that's a problem, obviously. So you don't want that. So the alternative then is to just let them grow the crop. So then so that way they're not fighting for the Taliban. But that just brings you back to the original problem of the Taliban taxing the opium. So it was kind of this impossible problem that could only be solved with efficacious government policy, which again was not forthcoming. So that was another major strategic issue for the government.
Geography question. Mm-hmm. How much farmland is in Afghanistan? Like, they can grow opium. From what I understand, it's pretty arid and it's pretty mountainous, so it's kind of a rugged landscape where they can't just crank out like a ton of corn or grain like the US can.
Yeah, it's more, I think it's more herding that people do, but there is enough land for some substantive agriculture, particularly in the south. There are some major rivers that kind of run through the semi-arid regions in the south, and so there's a lot of agriculture there. There's a province called Helmand province, which is particularly famous in Britain since they had a major deployment there. And basically, it's a decently sized province or district, but everybody just lives right next to the one river that runs through the district. And, it's kind of like the Nile River in Egypt. We kind of looked at a population density map before, and you see, like, even though Egypt is a big country, everybody lives around that one river.
Yeah.
So it's kind of similar in Helmand district. So yeah, there actually is a decent amount of land for agriculture, but it's heavily concentrated around the few water sources in the country. And so that's sort of where the opium is grown. And there's some room for agriculture in sort of the northeast, depending on the valley that you live in. But, the terrain is just very rough, so you can't really grow at scale. It's also worth mentioning that there's been something of an agricultural revolution in Afghanistan over the past 10 years. People started figuring out that you could buy solar panels relatively cheaply. And so what farmers have done is that they've started using power from cheap solar panels in order to power pumps, water pumps, so that they can pump water out of the ground. And they use that water in order to cultivate land that was previously just too arid to grow. So a lot of people have been bringing more land under cultivation. And a lot of the stuff they grow is frequently, cash crops like opium.
That's the thing with subsidies is like you could grow a food crop, but that's not going to pay as well as opium would. So why would you, unless the government is helping you or you are like that dedicated to, I want to make food crops.
Yeah.
You want to pay expenses, so that's a pretty big motivating factor. You were saying who is taxing the opium? Was it the Afghan government or the Taliban?
The Taliban.
Oh. But the government was not? Was the government just against the farming of it in general?
Yeah, they were against it in general because, it's a drug and, the responsibility of states internationally is to crack down on drug trade. So the Afghan government kind of felt obligated in part for that reason. But also the Taliban taxed it and they didn't tax it because, you can't really tax something that you explicitly ban. We're kind of doing that in the U.S. right now. Cannabis is sort of federally banned, but states have been allowing it. So there's this weird disequilibrium. So I guess you could say that's an example, but I don't think the feds tax cannabis specifically. They make money off of it just from income taxes and business taxes, but I don't think they, have a special tax for cannabis per se.
Yeah, I believe it's like a state sales tax kind of a thing. More of like a sin tax, kind of like what you do with cigarettes, where you have to pay a little bit of extra tax on it because it's not great for you. It's not like a vital necessity.
Gotcha.
But yeah, I think in the U.S., technically, if the feds wanted to raid a dispensary in a state that legalized recreational marijuana, they could do so and they would be within their rights. So it's kind of like we're risking it and kind of playing a game of chicken, more or less. And it's weird too, because being the president or whatever political faction is really driving for legalization, that becomes a big part of what your identity becomes. And a lot of politicians like don't want to be the weed president.
True. Well, the Afghan army faced a similar dilemma. They didn't want to be the opium government, so they banned it, didn't tax it, and as a result, it drove the market underground. Maybe they would have been better off legalizing it, but there would have been two problems. One, there would have been international opprobrium, and they were heavily dependent on foreign aid, so that wasn't really an option. Another problem is that a lot of the warlords in the government itself made a lot of money off of opium. In a lot of cases, they were the drug dealers who were making most of the money off of it. And so they would not have wanted it to be taxed. And they probably would have used their political leverage to prevent it from happening. So that's probably another reason the government didn't tax it. Let's see, I already mentioned that Ghani was a micromanager. So that was another problem, just a lack of flexibility and leadership. And then state building. I talked about this earlier. Just the idea that you could build a centralized state in Afghanistan was kind of wrong-headed from the start. However well-meaning it may have been, it just was not realistic. And we see the contradictions just kind of imploding right now. Contributing to the current implosion. So let's see. So that's the Afghan army and the Afghan government. Taliban strategy basically was just to wait. The old saying from the Mujahideen back in the day, back in the 80s, was, what was it? Somebody in chat probably knows exactly what I'm talking about. You have the watches, we have the time. The idea being that, yeah, we had a big technological advantage. We had all the material, all of the wealth, everything you would want to fight a war, but they were locals and they were going to stay permanently, and eventually we were going to go away. And, in the end, that was right. We just didn't have the staying power. The war never really had popular support in the United States, other than in the first couple years. And after that, it was just sort of a political hot potato. Basically, politicians in the U.S. played a game of musical chairs for 15 years trying to figure out who would get blamed for the inevitable eventual U.S. pullout. But the Taliban, meanwhile, just kind of had to sit pretty. They maintained some presence on the ground. They tried to pressure the government as much as they could, but they never really had to significantly challenge the government. Just by sheer staying power, they knew that they would eventually be the only major actor left. And that's pretty much what happened. So that was a big part of Taliban strategy right there. However, bland that may be. I already talked about how they're more of a coalition of different groups. So that was another big element, just trying to do the diplomatic work of maintaining these relationships between the different members of the coalition, which was pretty challenging. You saw that with Hekmatyar defecting to the government, and, a lot of the local franchises and bandit groups and whatnot, a lot of them would often flip sides depending on who was offering a better deal or depending on which way the wind seemed to be blowing in a local area. So it wasn't always easy to keep people in the coalition, but for the most part, they were able to make it work for long enough in order to outlast the U.S. and its Afghan state ally. As far as the current operation, it's actually pretty interesting. If you would ignore the implications, it's actually pretty interesting to look at the offensive that the Taliban has launched in the past couple months and try to judge it, kind of on its own merits. It's looking pretty smart, but it's not entirely clear just what the plan was. There's kind of two scenarios that I think, could describe the operation. One is that the Taliban just wanted to pressure the government as the United States left, and basically they would push in anywhere where the government pulled back. But if the government ever stood up, then they wouldn't continue. That's sort of the classical Maoist style, insurgency. So that may be what they're doing, and it may be that they never really planned to seize control of the whole country like this. They may have just been taking advantage of opportunities as they arose. And as they just kept rising, they just kept pushing until they basically seized the whole country. Now, another possibility is that this whole thing was planned and that they wanted to start it out in rural areas, kind of like I was just describing at the beginning here. They wanted to focus on supply lines, roads, wealthy districts, and border crossings. So they started at the periphery of the country, basically. And once they had that, then they started focusing on the larger cities, except for Kabul. And then they pushed into those, again, largely without fighting. Mostly what they would do is threaten the local political elites, the warlords and whatnot, and then they would just cut a deal with them. And once they had the, medium-sized cities, then they moved on Kabul, surrounded it. And, by that point, it was clear that they had all the momentum and that further resistance was probably futile. So in that sense, if it was planned from the start, it was pretty smart. They basically took advantage of all the Afghan military's weaknesses, focusing on rural areas where they had the least legitimacy and where the Taliban had relatively more legitimacy. That was smart. Making deals with warlords in cities, that took advantage of the lack of institutional coherence and the differences between leaders within the government coalition. And isolating Kabul, that just kind of speaks for itself. By that point, morale of the Afghan army has been depleted to the point where people would rather just melt away rather than fight. Mm-hmm. It's also worth pointing out here that the territory traditionally occupied by the Northern Alliance was one of the first regions to go. The Northern Alliance was the coalition of warlords that the United States worked with when it first invaded Afghanistan back in 2001. Before the U.S. invasion, the Taliban controlled all of Afghanistan except for the northeastern, roughly third or quarter of the country. And that was the quarter held by the Northern Alliance. So a lot of the major political leaders in the Afghan government had been members of that alliance. And, one of their problems, just to kind of add to the list here, is that the Northern Alliance was not Pashtun. And so they didn't have any legitimacy amongst the Pashtun part of the population. So a lack of coalition building there kind of screwed them as well. But anyway, the Northern Alliance territory was sort of the foundation for that group's power. And you would think that that could be the base of power for a resistance against the Taliban again, like it was in the 90s. But that's not going to happen because the Taliban went out of their way to focus on taking those areas at the beginning of their offensive. So it was actually the areas that had been the heart of resistance to the Taliban in the 90s that they focused on attacking here in this offensive. Again, pretty smart. Those were the areas they got first. So now after that, the only rural areas they didn't control were the areas where they were already relatively popular in the south. And those fell in pretty short order. I had another theory here. I don't know how much this theory is worth, because again, I don't have a background in the military, but for those who don't know, fighting in Afghanistan is seasonal. It's very old school, kind of harkens back to European warfare back in and before the 19th century. You fight during the spring and summer, and then you take it easy in the fall and winter because of the supply crunch and because the weather is bad, etc., etc. So in the fall and winter months in Afghanistan, generally, both sides don't really engage in major operations, especially the Taliban. And so most of the fighting generally happens in spring and summer. Unsurprisingly, the Taliban offensive against the government, kind of started in spring. So one of the things I think that the Taliban may have been thinking is that there was sort of a brief window between the time that the United States pulled out and the time when winter came and, the fighting season ended. So maybe the reason, if this offensive was planned out, from the start and wasn't just opportunistic, they may have been hoping to try to launch a major offensive in order to take control of the country in time to beat the winter. And they may have wanted to do that to prevent the government from retrenching over the winter. If they'd stopped fighting while they were only in control of half the country, then maybe the government could have dealt with some of its problems, however unlikely that may sound. But maybe they could have cut some deals with the warlords, armed the warlords, maybe they could have stiffened resistance a bit against the Taliban, such that when the fighting resumed next spring, the government would have been in a better position. So it may be that the Taliban sensed a moment of opportunity there, a moment of particular weakness on the part of the government that they wanted to take advantage of. So that could also explain the speed of the advance of the Taliban here and their sense of urgency. Again, speculation on my part, so make of that what you will. So just to kind of wrap this up, I guess, because we've been on it for a while, but what are some open questions? What's going to happen? What are we looking at? So one of the things people had been talking about was a refugee crisis. It was kind of generally expected that there would be a lot of fighting and that a lot of people would be dislocated. It's not clear that's going to happen now. It's looking like the Taliban are just going to get everything. So unless the Taliban starts fighting with itself, which again is possible, it doesn't look like there's going to be much impetus for a major refugee outflow. Events in Kabul's international airport notwithstanding. So it seems like that probably won't happen. Although again, it could, but it seems like maybe it won't, which would be, overall a good thing. You don't want people to be dislocated by massive endemic fighting. So hopefully that's part of the upside, in so much as there is one to current events here. Another big question, what are the Taliban going to do with Kabul? So when the Taliban lost power in 2001, the city of Kabul was about 500,000 people. Now it's 4.5 million. So it's a large city now, and it's not really clear if the Taliban know how to manage that. And also, a lot of the people who live in the city are urban now. To be fair, a lot of the people living in Kabul actually come from the rural areas because they're recent migrants. Urbanization in Afghanistan is relatively recent, owing to the, massive inflow of foreign aid and whatnot into Kabul. That really supercharged the city. But there is a small, there is a portion of the population at least that kind of came of age during after the U.S. invasion. And so those people are relatively liberal, relatively metropolitan. And so those are the people who are, sort of the most screwed and, the most disappointed right now. So it's not really clear what the Taliban is going to do with them. For the recent arrivals to the city, people who just came from rural areas, they're still pretty conservative, probably. They'll probably be able to adjust relatively quickly. But so for the urban middle class in Kabul, and so much as it has one, it's not clear what the plans are for them and what their fate is going to be. And I suspect there could be some drama on that count, because those are the people that Westerners, I think, most identify with. So whatever happens to them, I think, is probably going to define how the West remembers current events and the implications thereof. So that's all an open question there. International relations. China has come out and offered to extend the whatchamacallit corridor that it's building in Pakistan into Afghanistan. So basically making it part of their Belt and Road project. For those who don't know about Belt and Road, that's just a major international program that China is funding to build infrastructure and other projects in developing countries, as well as developed countries, just kind of anywhere and everywhere that is willing to take the money, basically. And that's the reasons why they do that is a whole discussion into itself. I won't get into that right now. But basically, the Chinese government seems to want to play ball with the Taliban, since it kind of sees them as the inevitable future government. China's in an awkward position because they're super sensitive about Islamic extremism on account of the Uyghur issue, which I think has been well discussed at this point. And they're, on the one hand, they don't want to deal with the Taliban because they would rather, just have a secular government of some kind in power. But on the other hand, if the Taliban are going to be in power, antagonizing them may just make the terrorism problem in China worse. So I think the Chinese government is going to try, at first anyway, to try to basically pay the Taliban to behave themselves and not interact with any potential Uyghur radicals that might be in Xinjiang or outside of Xinjiang. Whether or not that works out, anybody's guess. It's not clear. I mean, on the one hand, the Taliban probably are looking for a period of peace so that they can, stabilize things and consolidate their power. Starting some kind of conflict with the People's Republic of China is probably not appealing to them right now. But on the other hand, they have just beaten the United States. So that's probably going to give them some ideas. It may make them a little bit ambitious, depending on their leadership. Their leadership right now is actually pretty young because they had a transition recently. But I don't know. He may listen to his advisors and kind of go with a more cautious path. We'll see. So let's see, that's China. There's also Pakistan. So the ISI obviously has ties with the Taliban. So on the one hand, you could say that Pakistan is going to be very happy with this development because they have their proxy back. But on the other hand, the Taliban may judge that they don't really need the ISI anymore because, the whole point of the collaboration was to take control of Afghanistan. But once they have it, why do they still need the ISI? So I suspect that they'll continue to maintain relations with the ISI, just until things kind of settle down. But after that, it's not entirely clear what direction the relationship will go. It's a little bit ambiguous. So that'll be something else to watch going forward. Russia kind of has ambiguous ties with the Taliban. There's been persistent rumors that the Russian government has been supplying them with arms. I don't know how true those claims are, but certainly some Russian arms have ended up in Afghanistan. Given how many they produced during the Cold War, though, that's not really that surprising. Soviet weapons became so ubiquitous at one point that they became symbols. There's a country in Africa called Mozambique that actually has an AK-47 on their national flag because the revolutionary government that took power there used them a lot during the revolution against the Portuguese. So there's a lot of Russian weapons around, and I don't know that you can entirely blame Russia if there's a lot of them getting into conflict zones being used against Americans. But then maybe I'm wrong and they do supply them. I don't know. Anybody's guess. But basically, the Russian government doesn't like this. They would rather not have to worry about Islamic fundamentalists in their region, because Central Asia is basically their region. That is where their sphere of influence is the strongest. Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan are all well within Russia's sphere of influence. They're all CSTO members. They're all part of the Eurasian Economic Union, so that is kind of their backyard. And I think Russian troops even were mobilized in Tajikistan and moved towards the border just as a precaution, and possibly also as a signal to the Taliban not to screw around. So Russia will probably be uncomfortable for a while until they figure out what the Taliban wants to do, and just how ambitious they may be in terms of their foreign policy, in so much as they even have one. And then there's Al Qaeda, which of course is the whole reason the United States was there in the first place. It's not entirely clear how strong relations are between the Taliban and Al Qaeda. Intuitively, you would think they would get along, just because they're both Islamic fundamentalists. But, on the other hand, having close ties with Al Qaeda ended in the Taliban being ejected from power and spending 20 years fighting a global superpower. So that's kind of a downside. I'm sure they're not afraid that the United States is going to come back anytime soon, but that doesn't mean we couldn't do some damage if we wanted to. That's the problem with going from a revolutionary to a governor. Revolution is easy. You just have to break shit. Governance is hard.
Yep.
And right now, the Taliban are looking set to become the new governors of Afghanistan. So that puts the United States in a nice position that it hasn't been in a while, where it can just be the spoiler. We don't have to worry about the legitimacy of the government. We can just blow shit up if we want to send a signal. Not unlike what the Taliban have been doing. So I'm sure that they would rather avoid that. So that does give the U.S. some leverage there in order to discourage them from resuming ties with Al Qaeda. But on the other hand, Al Qaeda, well, maybe on another hand anyway, the Taliban are, like I was saying before, are very decentralized. So it may be that they don't really even have the capacity as an institution to stop members of the Taliban from cooperating with the Al Qaeda, either with or without the Taliban's permission. So in that sense, Afghanistan could be on the verge of becoming a failed state, in so much as it wasn't already. In which case, there's not much the Taliban can really do about Al Qaeda resuming activities in the country. For those of you who are worried about this, I would say don't. It's probably not going to be a big deal, because the Al Qaeda pretty much already has parts of the world where they can conduct operations relatively freely. Yemen, Somalia, maybe even Mozambique, having mentioned it before. So those are all areas where Al Qaeda has already been operating relatively freely for a while, albeit not Al Qaeda Central. Those are sort of made franchises of one sort or another. But the likelihood of Al Qaeda setting up in Afghanistan is, within the realm of possibility. But if they do, it's not necessarily going to add a lot to their pre-existing capacity. So I wouldn't necessarily worry about some campaign of terrorist bombings of one sort or another. Let's see, we already talked about the prospects for a civil war. It's probably unlikely. If it happens, it won't happen until later, I think. The Taliban have their coalition, and then they have all the warlords that they cut deals with in the sort of closing stage of the war here. So any one of those actors could turn on the Taliban or on each other and start fighting for control of this, that, or the other resource. But I think for now, everybody is going to wait and see what the Taliban do and see how successful they are at consolidating power. So that'll probably give them a couple months at least, or maybe a year, before things start to fall apart for them, if they do at all. Drugs. What happens with all the opium? You know, the Taliban famously banned opium, growing opium and selling opium back in the 90s, although it wasn't necessarily to great effect. Production did fall, it did have some effect, but it never really went away completely. So there's going to be a temptation, I suspect, on the part of the Taliban to continue to tax opium and to continue to allow it to be grown, simply for the revenue. You know, Afghanistan is going to need, their new government is going to need a lot of money, you know, not only for running the economy and the state, but also to maintain all of the patronage networks amongst all the warlords and whatnot, to maintain their coalition. So the drug problem is probably not going to go away, and if the Taliban do try to curb it, if they do ban it again, that could be the instigator for a civil war, in which case maybe they will have a civil war within the next couple of months. We'll see. That's something else to watch. I also heard some people on Reddit saying that there might be ethnic cleansing. There's an ethnic group called the Hazara in central Afghanistan that are actually Shia Muslims as opposed to Sunni Muslims. And they're seen as apostates by, you know, the more radical members of the Sunni fundamentalist community. So some people were concerned that maybe the Taliban would just wipe them out. I don't know that that's necessarily going to be a problem. I mean, there was some violence against them in the 90s, but I don't think there was a concerted campaign to obliterate them either. So I suspect the Taliban will find it more efficacious to try to work with Hazara power brokers in Hazara areas than it will be to try to launch some massive military campaign. Again, everybody's pretty tired of fighting at this point. I don't know how many people are looking to expand the war in one way or another. So again, I suspect that for the next couple months to the next year, roughly that time frame, things will be relatively peaceful while the new order kind of sets itself up.
Yeah, that was one of the question marks for ISIS setting up was, okay, you took the territory, but have you been recognized by the world stage as a legitimate state yet? That's pretty tough to do. Establishing legitimacy takes a different kind of administrative work than it does to make military advances. So sure, you got the greatest number of soldiers to take the country. Can you lead the country?
Yeah, it's not clear what they're going to do in that regard. You know, governance is important. But I don't know. There's been some stories of revenge killings, like in more rural areas where the Taliban have been taking control. And there was one town where they were going around trying to figure out which men had been soldiers for the government or had been employees of the government, because they wanted to try to take their wives as war booty, basically, which is a thing that you can do. It's according to the sort of traditional rules of war. Under Sharia law or sort of whatever old Pashtunwali code of honor over there, you can kind of take your opponent's women as a reward if you defeat them in battle. So that could also happen. That's one of the reasons that some of the higher level professionals in Afghanistan who worked for the government have been particularly eager to get out of the country. Yeah, the Taliban doesn't like them. One example is pilots. It takes a long time to train good pilots, so Afghan pilots have been a particular target for the Taliban. They've gone out of their way to try to assassinate them wherever they can find them.
We talked about that with regards to World War II and how you can crank out planes, but operating a plane well enough to capitalize on the cost of the plane is pretty tough to do. And once a pilot dies, they can't use a plane anymore. So the pilot count can be a limiting factor in addition to the plane count.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that was the Battle of Britain. The British were able to produce all the planes they needed, but pilots were a different matter. They were starting to run a little short during the Battle of Britain. It got a little hairy for a while. Yeah, I think this is pretty much all I have on Afghanistan. So hopefully that's a decent update for people.
Yeah, I'd say so. If people have further questions, this will be on YouTube, so you could ask them in the comments and we can address them on the next one.
Please do. We doing okay on time?
Yep. Good to go for another hour if you want.
Oh, cool. What else has been going on?
Yeah, anytime you get a huge, big ticket news item like that, that's what everyone's asking about. And then you're kind of like, wait, what else happened this week?
I did see in the news today that Canada is going to have an election pretty soon.
Oh, first, Moss Neotech is missing his favorite part of Agent Smith, which is the disclaimer.
Oh, thank you. I should have done that at the start. Yeah, so the usual disclaimer is that I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here, probably most of it. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me if I'm wrong. I want to know more than anybody. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later, so I will see your comments. So participation is encouraged in that regard.
Just on my personal end, I've been getting a lot more conspiracy theory stuff in my chat, and also a lot of like nationalism and stuff. And the disclaimer that you just shared with us is something that you would never hear from people who are like super convicted about their position. It kind of felt like I was being put on trial for like not being logical or rational enough, and they were just telling me like it is, as opposed to a conversation where you're open to being wrong and you welcome being wrong, in the sense that you now save yourself from being wrong about that issue for the rest of your life. That was a thing that we had a good dynamic with, hanging out with Kukyo and such, where if we're all hanging out and talking, it's not a contest of like, all right, who's going to be the smartest person this evening? The battle begins, and then we have a conversation, and it's like, no, you're wrong about this. Ha, I won that argument. It's like, all right, if you know something I don't, then okay, you can take the steering wheel for a bit and you can tell us something. Then now we're in the position of asking questions to clarify and poke holes in what you're saying, which ends up being really pleasant and productive. It makes conversation a lot less exhausting if you're open to learning what other people have to say, and you're going off like articles that have been posted. So it's possible that you, in good faith, read an article that either was based on bad information or the person was intentionally making it misleading, and we're not going to be able to catch everything. So please help.
Yes, please do. You know, one of the fun things about doing this is that I learn from chat. You know, if I do say something stupid or wrong, people will jump in. That's kind of one of the laws of the internet. If you want somebody to share knowledge with you, one of the fastest ways to do it is to say something that's wrong, because then people will just pile in. Like, no, that's not true. This is what's true. So, you know, I appreciate that process. You know, I've benefited from this as well. Let me see if I can find... This isn't important per se. I'm looking at the Anime Olympic World Flags website. I wanted to see if they had Afghanistan in here. I don't think they do. More's the pity. Did you get a chance to peruse that at all?
Yeah, the different characters of the different countries, that one you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, the US one I'm not a fan of. Some of them looked really cool.
Well, keep in mind they're from a Japanese perspective.
Yeah.
You know, for Japan, the United States is a young, inexperienced country with a lot of power. So they tend to frame us in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Did you like Canada's special power?
What was it?
They can heal friends using maple leaf tipped arrows.
I love it.
Yeah, for those of you who have been to this website, you can click on the characters here, and they'll actually have little character descriptions. And sometimes they have like special powers, depending on their country's background.
Mm.
It's pretty fun.
Let's see. We talked about North Korea. That's going to be a story for a while. Stuff happening in Iraq. Nothing too dramatic right now. Let's see. We got Afghanistan, U.S. healthcare, USMCA, Cuba. We talked about Cuba already. I guess we could take another chunk out of that China stuff we've been doing.
Sure.
Hope that's not getting too boring. And could probably sneak in maybe one or two here. So for those of you who don't know what this is, for the past 3 episodes now, I think 3 or 4, I've been just going through my notes on China, stuff that we didn't have time for over the past roughly year and a half. And I've just been kind of touching on, certain items in order to try to provide you guys with a sort of bigger picture of China and its politics, its economy, its society, etc. Up till now, we've been mostly focusing on political stuff, but I think we finished that last time, and I think the next section is economic stuff. So these are basically vignettes. They're not meant to describe everything. It's not meant to be like a macro look at China per se. It's just meant to be individual vignettes that altogether give you the big picture. So that's the idea there. So here, I guess we'll just do 2. Maybe just 1. The finance section is huge, and I keep having to modify it because I keep adding stuff to it. Yeah, we'll do 1 and then we'll move on to something else. So I guess the item here just for today, and this will just be real short, this has to do with China's economy. And the note here in this article just has to do with declining returns on investment. So the return on investment basically peaked in China in the private sector in 2015. And since then, it's been in decline. So you can still get decent returns in China. It's not like people aren't investing in it. But in general, it needs, the rate of return is in decline. So it's not as attractive as it used to be. The rate of it, the specific data point here is the return on investment for capital has fallen by half since 2012, which is a significant decline. And what that suggests is that investment is just becoming more inefficient over time. All of the stuff that you could invest in before that would get you a really high return, all of that stuff has kind of run its course, and now the stuff that's available for investment is not nearly as lucrative. There's also structural problems with the economy that make it difficult for firms to be efficient. And the Chinese economy and government basically have kind of tapped out the easy sources of growth, what you might call catch-up growth, that kind of drove China's economic growth over the past couple decades. Any further economic growth is going to have to come from improvements to productivity. And thus far, the government has not really shown the willingness to implement the necessary reforms to make that happen. So in general, return on investment is falling. The economy is getting more inefficient, relatively speaking. So what are some case studies of this? And so the case studies from the article I had here, and I can, I'll post the link for you guys. I'll send this to you, Neuro. If I can find you. Here we go. So that's a Cato Institute report that I got this from. So the specific case study that the report refers to touches on rail. Oh, actually, that was the article. Okay. So the report talked about return on investment. And then I had an article that talked about the case study on the rail network. So I'll send that to you as well. So basically, high-speed rail operators are sort of widespread in China. The Chinese government invested a lot in the development of a high-speed rail industry. Japan has kind of traditionally dominated that, but the Chinese government wanted it to be one of the
sort of flagship industries in China that helped lead the way towards economic development and moving the economy up the value chain so that the Chinese economy could produce stuff that was advanced and technologically sophisticated and hire lots of college graduate workers and give them a good wage, as opposed to producing knickknacks and mass-produced factories that employ low-wage rural migrant labor. That's the idea anyway. So in large part, they were pretty successful in developing a high-speed rail industry, and they've built a lot in China. But they've apparently never really been very profitable, with a few exceptions. Basically, the note here in the article is that more than 60% of the country's high-speed railway operators have each lost a minimum of around $100 million in 2018. And they've also continued, they continued losing money into the first half of 2019 as well. So some specific examples here. In Chengdu, a city in western China in Sichuan province, that's the least profitable rail network, and they actually reported a loss in 2018 of $1.8 billion. Pretty steep. Two others mentioned were Shenyang, which I believe is in Shandong province, if I'm not mistaken. No, that's actually Manchuria. Shenyang and Harbin are both cities in Manchuria, so they each have their own rail network, or at least they're integrated in the rail network anyway. So the operators there reported losing more than $1.5 billion last year, which was 2019, as of publishing of this particular article. Now, another example is the Beijing-Shanghai line. And that particular line is actually one of the standout success stories. They're very profitable. So it's not like all of them are losing money. Also, for those interested in how we know about this, because of course, the Chinese government is very cagey about things that don't reflect well on it. So obviously they have little incentive to be honest about losing money on projects like this. So the reason we know about this is because the Beijing-Shanghai rail line, the business that owns it, more accurately, had to make financial disclosures as part of its IPO. There's been a big push by a lot of corporations in China to take advantage of IPOs and Western financial markets, as well as Hong Kong. And as part of that process, they've had to engage in, the usual kinds of disclosures you would expect a corporation to have to make in a sort of rule of law environment. And as a result, they've been disclosing a lot more information than they had been previously when they were only operating in China. So what that disclosure revealed is that the line, which opened in 2011, again, this is the Beijing-Shanghai line, it opened at a cost of $29 billion, and then it turned a profit 5 years later in 2016. And since then, it's had an average annual profit of $1.3 billion. So that line has turned out to be very profitable. No surprise, Beijing and Shanghai are sort of the leading cities in China. But still, that illustrates that it can be done right. However, lots of examples of rail lines that just fail. They've had to take on a lot of debt, and in a lot of cases, they haven't used that debt very well, very effectively. And a lot of governments have used these lines to employ a lot of workers, basically as a kind of sink for unemployment for when the economy isn't doing well. And, that's great if you're a worker who needs a job, but it's not really great for pushing workers to be more efficient, pushing the firm to lay off people so that they can make the people they retain more efficient. That sort of usual dynamic that firms engage in that pushes them to become more efficient is not at present when you're using firms like this as a policy tool to mitigate unemployment. More state-owned firms like this, they're generally all state-owned in one degree or another, either by the government at the national level or local level. More and more of them are issuing IPOs, and so that means we're going to see more information about, their finances. So we'll probably learn more about how efficient or inefficient they are in the future, but thus far, it's not looking good. It hasn't been a pretty picture. What the government is hoping, though, is that these disclosures are going to actually help because they want more market discipline for state-owned enterprises. We've talked before about how state-owned enterprises are a huge drain on the Chinese government's finances. And while financial problems are kind of not necessarily a major problem, since the government has the power to basically just destroy debt, create debt, when you don't have rule of law, you can kind of just do whatever you want. But it's still a problem if state state-owned enterprises are inefficient. They would like them to be more efficient, and they would also like not to have to use radical monetary and fiscal tools to deal with a major collapse of a state-owned enterprise or, a debt default by localities or what have you. Even if the government has the power to diffuse a major financial crisis, it would be better not to have to in the first place. So the government is making moves here to try to get SOEs to be more efficient. One of the ways to do that is to instill market discipline, and in this case, one of the ways is by pushing these firms to become more publicly owned as opposed to purely state-owned. Let's see. Also, as a side note here, China invests a lot of money in developing rail lines overseas. The reasons are obvious. If there's a major project overseas to develop a rail line or a high-speed rail line, you can get them to buy from you if you provide the loans necessary to fund the project. So often lending overseas for projects is basically just an extension of China's industrial policy to develop certain key strategic industries, and high-speed rail has been one of them. But it was noted here in the article that a lot of these rail lines are not profitable in the same way that the rail lines in China are generally not. So it seems that this is kind of a systemic problem with the rail lines themselves and how they're run, not only in China, but also where Chinese producers and rail operators are sort of in operation. So that's just a quick snapshot there of major investment projects in China. In general, they become more inefficient with time, and now it's gotten to the point where the government is really trying to reform them by instituting relatively more market discipline. And the case study, again, was high-speed rail there. I think I'll take another week to refine this. There's always more stuff on China's financial sector, Neuro, because they've implemented a major reform drive over the past year, so it's just in the news every week. If you want a preview on that, I'll do it next time. I have to do it next time because I don't have anything else I can kind of deflect to here. It has to be next time. So we'll do China's financial sector then, whenever that is. And for a quick preview of that, I'm going to be talking about the history of China's regulations of the financial industry there. There's a lot on that. It's going to be way longer than the thing I just did. And after I talk about the regulations, then I'm going to get into some of the changes that have been happening in the industry, and I'll roughly compare where the industry is at right now in China with the American financial sector, just to give you an idea of how much the Chinese financial sector has grown with time and what some of its strengths and weaknesses are relative to foreign competitors. Hopefully that doesn't sound too boring. It's actually really interesting because it's sort of the next major step for the Chinese economy. They've had agriculture for thousands of years, but over the course of the 20th century, they developed manufacturing industries. And so now they're trying to move their economy to the next level into the services sector and develop things like tech firms and whatnot, which generally dominate the news, but they also want to develop the financial sector for the same reason, to generate better, higher paying jobs. So this is a major development for China's economy and their next stage in development. And it's also a major project for the government. This is something that they're kind of managing very specifically. It's, maybe even micromanaging too much. That's a whole other debate. But whether this succeeds or fails is going to have major implications for not only China's economy but its politics, because there's a lot of people who have their jobs and reputations dependent on making this work. So hopefully that's a decent enough sales pitch to get people interested in what is otherwise a very bland sounding topic. I don't know that a lot of people like talking about the financial industry. It sounds like a lot of math and very little payoff.
But people get excited about money.
Well, everybody gets excited about money, but people don't necessarily get excited about regulations. So I'll try to make it interesting for people when we do talk about it. Yeah, I've got stuff on the stock market, mutual funds, the bond market, commodities market, all kinds of good stuff. So again, preview for next time. Tune in next time on Agent Smith and Neuro, or Neuro and Agent Smith. Your name should go first.
World discussion with Agent Smith.
There you go. In academia, it's generally like, well, actually, it differs by field in academia. I think in some fields you put the authors in alphabetical order. And then in other fields, you basically put the main author first, and then sort of the subsidiary authors who did less work kind of come after. Alphabetic is probably the better way to go there. Less problems with ego. Unfortunately, academics are not immune to ego. There's been more than a few disputes over minor stuff like that. Oh, did we have any questions by chance?
They were most all about Afghanistan, so
Gotcha. Let's see. Well, what else? I think, did we want to talk about the lightning strike in India, or did I talk about that already?
I don't know what that is. I don't think you did.
Let's see. Let me find it real quick. Basically, it was like, this isn't really a news event. I just thought it was really weird, or at least unusual. There's a tourist spot in India, in the state of Rajasthan. I'm sure I'm butchering the pronunciation there. And it's a city called Jaipur, and it's on top of a castle. There's a castle there, and you can go to the top of it and take pictures and whatever. So there was a bunch of people that went up there and did that, but it just happened to be there was like a storm, or it was about to storm, or some damn thing. But basically, there was a lightning strike, and it hit the tourists on the top of the castle, and it ended up killing 16 people. I'd never heard of that. I didn't know so many people could die in a lightning strike. Oh, it was in the rain. Okay, so it was raining. There was actually a rainstorm at the time, so that probably didn't help. Yeah, it was a 12th century fort, Amur Fort in Jaipur. Apparently there was a number of lightning strikes in other parts of the country as well. Yeah, from what I read, one of the reasons for lightning strike deaths in India, or at least one of the reasons they're relatively high, is because that a lot of people work outdoors in agriculture and construction. So there's disproportionately more people exposed to it than maybe in other countries. So not necessarily the biggest news you'll hear, but interesting trivia anyway. Well, did you have any questions, Neuro? Anything you wanted to touch on here?
What did I peruse this week? One of the things that's been really frustrating for me is still some of the carryover of politicizing the mask issue. There have been a bunch of places that have closed down a little bit more due to the Delta variant. It's sort of what we expected. By once the restrictions are lifted somewhat, then there's going to be more of an outbreak, just as you would expect. But I guess the question is the economic trade-off worth it? We had some people from Australia who were pretty concerned about the impact on the economy. And just generally, they've been pretty dissatisfied with how Australia has been doing recently. And I think that was between Agent Smith segments.
Ah.
So do you know anything about that?
Yeah, there's been protests in Australia. There were some big ones in, well, maybe not big ones, but decent-sized anti-mask protests in Sydney, I think a couple weeks ago. It was sufficient enough of a problem that the government called in the army, and they've been using the army to enforce quarantine measures in Sydney. I hope Sydney is the right city. I hope I'm not mixing it up. But yeah, the army was called in, and so you can actually see, videos of the Australian army operating in Sydney. Pretty dramatic stuff. Yeah, people are just upset about the quarantine. I think, in general, we could have expected that. If you just have quarantine for a couple months, shutdowns, lockdowns, mask measures, whatever. If it's just a couple months, it's more manageable. But once it starts stretching into years, then you're asking for trouble. The more you impose on people, the more you inconvenience people, just in general, the more likely you are to start getting more pushback as time goes on. That's just a human nature thing. That's just kind of that's just normal pretty much. So that's something you can see in pretty much every country now. There's just a lot of lockdown fatigue amongst greater and greater portions of the population.
Mm.
And they've been getting more and more restive as a result. There have been more protests in Europe in that vein, for that matter. Might see them in China. The Delta variant is starting to spread around in China, and I'm a little bit curious as to what they're going to do about it. That's a really interesting question, because the Delta variant is famous for being a very fast spreader. That's not the technical language, but it's highly contagious, much more so than the other variants that have come before, at least as I understand it. So it may be that the Chinese government has an advantage in the sense that it can just do whatever it wants, so it can implement the harshest shutdown measures as necessary to stop the spread of the virus. I kind of wonder if maybe the Delta variant isn't going to spread so fast that maybe even those measures don't work. And if not, that's going to put the Chinese government in a super awkward position. Because one of the things the government did is to tie its legitimacy to how well it was able to contain the virus in the first year. And if they can't do it now with the Delta variant, that's going to create a lot of criticism. Or it's going to create the potential for criticism anyway. So we'll see what they do with that. It has been spreading. There was a outbreak rather. There was an outbreak in Wuhan and also Ningbo, which is a major port city, which is also bad news for inflation, by the way. One of the big drivers of inflation right now, at least in the United States, is the container shortage. Have we talked about this before?
I don't think so. You mean like shipping containers?
Yeah, shipping containers. Yeah, what happened is that in the United States, specifically in California, a lot of shipping containers built up over the course of the pandemic. When it started in China, there was a lot of stuff getting exporting from China to the United States, but not necessarily much from the United States to China, because the Chinese economy kind of, tanked for a while at the early stage of the pandemic. So a whole bunch of shipping containers kind of just built up in the United States over time because people weren't sending as much stuff back to China. Well, what happened later when the virus spread to the United States, there was a whole bunch of lockdown measures and restrictions that made it relatively harder for dock workers in major ports in California to load and unload stuff from container ships. And the result over time is that the buildup of containers in California got worse because containers kept coming in, because the United States kept buying stuff from China, especially as the Chinese economy improved. And so those containers were able to be brought in, but they weren't able to be brought out because they couldn't load them back onto the ships, basically. And the result is that the overall number of containers available for the shipping industry fell over time. And they've been trying to reintroduce them. In general, the restrictions have been relaxed in California, or at least they were before the Delta variant. But they weren't able to make it happen fast enough to really significantly dent inflation. In general, shipping rates went up, delays went up, and it just became harder generally for goods to move between China and the United States. So that was the impetus for the shipping container shortage. And now it's looking like it's going to get worse. Because a major port in China, Ningbo, was basically shut down because the Delta variant was detected there. So now it's looking like there's going to be even more of a shortage of transport capacity, as well as logistical disruptions, more broadly. I still don't think inflation is going to be a big problem going forward, but the more stuff that happens, the longer it's going to go on, and the longer it goes on, the more risk there is that it ends up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. Once inflation reaches that stage, it's very difficult to get rid of. So that's a big problem. And central banks all over the world are probably very eager to avoid that as best they can. Yeah, COVID has been making quite the comeback in the past month or two with the Delta variant. Indonesia has been getting hit really hard. Yeah, I read that in a lot of cases where the Delta variant is really taking part of the problem was just complacency. A lot of places just kind of got a little comfortable. Places like Australia maybe or Indonesia where they'd kind of handled it relatively well. And so people kind of thought, now we're kind of reaching the end game, it's almost over. And then boom, the new variant comes in and just kind of hammered them. Yeah, one of the big stories in 2021 is that all of the countries that handled COVID really well in 2020 have been getting hit hard in 2021.
Mm.
So Australia, to a degree, I guess they're not getting hit really hard, but they're getting hit a lot harder than they were back in 2020, at least anything I can remember from the time. And Japan has been getting outbreaks. Taiwan has been getting outbreaks. Vietnam finally got some cases. Vietnam was famous for a while because they actually didn't have any. And then they had their first one like late in 2020 or something like that. They were very good.
Were
They
they
either
really
did
strict with the lockdown or something?
They were really strict with the lockdown. Yeah, they got the authoritarian government, so they kind of were able to do stuff similar to what the Chinese government did. And in general, they just were very proactive in handling it, such that they were kind of a standout performer in terms of containing it.
Mm-hmm.
But then this year, not so much. This year they're having outbreaks to a degree that would have been unfathomable, in 2020. So Vietnam's getting hit. Southeast Asia in general has been getting a lot. India, obviously. Although in India, it's kind of a mystery why they weren't hit hard in 2020. Everybody, I think, was kind of expecting it because India's healthcare system is a little wobbly. But for some reason, it just didn't really hit them as badly as people were expecting. And now the Delta variant is here, and now it's definitely hitting them as hard as everyone was expecting. This is more what I would have expected last year. So India definitely getting hammered now. Latin America has had it pretty bad too. I think they've had the worst deaths per case or something like that. Basically the worst hit region, just in terms of per capita death and destruction. But I don't know that they've been hit particularly bad by the Delta variant because they were never really able to contain it in the first place, especially in Brazil, for obvious reasons. He's been busy lately too. You remember Jair Bolsonaro, right?
And the guy who doesn't know how to do push-ups? Yep.
Yeah, yeah.
He would
He's
get
been
Brazil's finest athletes and get them to all do push-ups, then he would flop on the ground in a gesture of solidarity with their amazing
There you
fitness.
one and the same, one and the same. So he's been making noise about corruption in Brazil's electoral system. And he's been talking, one of the things he talked about, I think, a week or two ago is he wanted to change out Brazil's electronic voting machines. He wanted to have either a paper-based system or a hybrid electronic and paper-based system, which personally I don't think is a bad idea, actually. I don't particularly trust electronic voting systems, but in Brazil's context, and especially in the context of Jair Bolsonaro, the broad-based suspicion is that he's up to something. That maybe his concerns are not entirely genuine, and people are a little paranoid about him tampering with something as sensitive as Brazil's electoral institutions. So people have been keeping an eye on him in particular over the past couple weeks on account of that.
I think we did have some questions coming in too. I think Moss was helping out.
Oh, cool. Let me see if I can find the right thing.
Category Priv Biz near the top. Bottom section, Agent Smith.
Questions if we need them. Thank you, Mass Neotech. First question, if we're speaking about weather phenomena, what about the 7.2 magnitude earthquake that hit Haiti? Not technically weather, but I know what you mean. Yeah, that hit Haiti yesterday, I think. It's a big earthquake. And I don't know that they ever really fully recovered from the last big one back in like 2010. Do you remember that, Neuro?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, did a lot of damage. It basically just obliterated Port-au-Prince. So I don't know how destructive this one could have been, given how, how ravaged the country was from the last one. But yeah, it did some damage.
Well,
Disturbed the rubble, you
one of
might say.
the tricky things with that is you get an earthquake in an area. How do you build earthquake resistant structures? Because I think we have some of those up here in the Seattle area, but there's a very different amount of wealth in Washington state versus in Haiti. So like getting the correct materials and putting things in the right places where they're going to take less damage. Like I think the building that I live in has a bunch of metal in it that's kind of wobbly on purpose, where it's better if your structure can bend comfortably rather than if it's really rigid and brittle. Like concrete, I think, is notorious for doing really poorly in earthquakes because it doesn't have any give to it. Either it's
Yeah.
super, super solid or it just cracks and crumbles.
It's expensive. I mean, in Japan's case, it's expensive. Japan is sort of the world leader in creating earthquake resistant buildings. They've got big giant springs and other construction methods that they have to try to make buildings a little more resilient. But Japan is also super densely populated, and they've got all these big super towers and whatnot. So it's a little different in Haiti's case. They don't have buildings that are that big. So I suspect the physics would be a little bit different there. If you want to make a small house, resistant to an earthquake, it's probably different than the necessary techniques for a large tower.
Mm-hmm.
And I personally don't know enough about the science behind that to really comment on it too much. But I suspect, regardless, it's going to cost a fair amount of money. And Haiti just doesn't have that, especially right now. Keep in mind, they're still reeling from the assassination of the president a couple months ago. So that's something that hasn't really been entirely unwound. So it helps to have a coherent functioning government. They could help you pay for something like that or have some kind of program or, whatever. But as is, that ain't happening anytime soon. So I suspect that the principal earthquake prevention in Haiti right now is going to just be the population's previous experience with earthquakes and whatever measures they've conspired to try to deal with them and the aftermath. But yeah, I don't have too much else to add on that. Major natural disasters like that pretty much run a particular course. They happen either expectedly or unexpectedly, wipe out a bunch of property, kill a bunch of people, and then the government is sort of left to pick up the pieces as best it can. I will say that the Caribbean has been hit with a lot of these lately. Natural disasters, that is to say. Not necessarily earthquakes per se, although that has happened, but also hurricanes. Honduras has actually not yet recovered from a major hurricane that happened 10 years ago? 10 years ago, roughly. I forget the exact year it was. But they got hammered. The northeastern part of the country just got hammered, and they've never really fully recovered from it. It's actually one of the contributing factors to all of the immigration the U.S. has been getting from Central America lately. Okay, next question. So, any thoughts on the Delta variant being far less deadly than others despite being more contagious? Now, let me preface this by saying I have no background in biology. I took like one biology class on pathogens in college, and that was a long time ago. So this isn't really my area. And I think, Neuro, you had that guy. He was a PhD in biology. You had him on. You remember who I'm talking about? Wait, are you still there?
I went to get water. I'm back.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was asking, you had that speaker on stream, the PhD in biology. Do you remember him?
Immunology, yes, his name is Will Blur in chat. And we may do a follow-up episode pretty soon, actually.
Yeah, that would be a good idea because I'm sure he would have much more intelligent things to say about the Delta variant than me.
Mm-hmm.
So I would definitely refer to his opinions on this. If I had to comment on it, I guess I don't, but I will anyway, just because. In the spirit of the segment, I'll take my best crack at it. From what I understand, it's not unusual for viruses to evolve like this, where they become less deadly but more contagious. if it's more deadly, then it kills the host before it can spread. So as it becomes less deadly, it kind of corresponds with greater contagiousness, greater contagion. Not sure what the right word is there. But yeah, this is pretty much the normal course for viral evolution, at least as I understand it. So not necessarily a surprise in that sense.
Yeah, and I think some people had a bit of a misconception about what the vaccine is meant to do. I think some people were under the assumption that boom, boom, you get your 2 shots, you've got COVID immunity, good job. But it's more like getting some resistance amount, and you can't really cap out your resistance to be 100% immune to all COVID-19 strains that exist or could exist. It's just to improve your chances at resisting it a little bit and reduce the chances that you transmit it and reduce the chance that you will die from it.
Yeah, it also reduces the severity of the symptoms, from what I've read. So even if you don't die of it, you could still have some pretty nasty symptoms, some of which could last for a very long time. The COVID is a very weird virus. It's got some weird properties. It kind of interacts with certain physiologies in sort of an unusual way. One of the things I've read is that it has a disproportionate impact on the pancreas, to the point where there's been like a spike in diabetes in India, because the pancreas has been targeted in certain kinds of people, or in a disproportionately large portion of people who've been infected. Just weird stuff like that. Certain organs kind of get hit particularly hard by it for some reason. I've also read stuff about it impacting like blood clotting in the lungs, something like that. Again, I would have to defer to somebody with more, more scientific background in the topic than me. But yeah, I've read that there's been some unexpected impacts of COVID on people who have had it.
You know what I'm looking forward to? When we can stop politicizing health as an issue. It's pretty ridiculous, the amount of like them making it into a progressive versus conservative issue, and a lot of that is just where people are getting their news from. There's a lot of
good luck with that
anti-vax kind of stuff going around.
Yeah,
there are a bunch of people. There was someone in my chat who was saying like, dude, look at this Bible verse in the book of Revelation, like that's the COVID vaccine, dude. And it's like, what? People are not going to be able to buy or sell any goods in the near future because they're getting the mark of the beast, and if they don't have the COVID vaccine, they can no longer do trade. And I was like, what? But they're sharing this kind of stuff, and they legit believe it, because a lot of it comes from the charisma and the conviction of the person who's talking, and that's a big part of where Agent Smith, he's not going to be able to sell you anything really well because he might be wrong about it. But the people who are really good at selling snake oil, they're like, this is going to save the world. And they're pitching it like it's some really big political battle, when it could just be, okay, you're a person who wants to opt out for X, Y, or Z reason.
Yeah.
No, it's a government's conspiracy to all turn us into drones.
Yeah, I don't really know what to do about that.
Me neither.
That just kind of feels baked in at this point.
It's part of the meme.
Yeah, that kind of ties into an overarching debate about how to regulate social media. And that's a whole conversation unto itself. So, without getting into that, I don't know how much you can really attack misinformation like that. It may be that it doesn't even matter at this point. At this point, it could just be that people are reflexively embracing anti-vax ideas just out of contrarianism, out of spite, out of support for the last president. There's different factors at play there that make people more likely to embrace it. And some of those reasons are, one could argue somewhat frivolous, but regardless of how frivolous they may be, it's no less genuine amongst the true believers. And when you tie up something like this, anti-vaccine beliefs, with underlying political tensions and political preferences, then it's just really difficult to unwind. Probably impossible. So I wouldn't hold out too much hope that that's going to go away anytime soon. Although there has been more people in certain vaccine hesitant states that have been getting the vaccine because they've noticed how disproportionately hard
conservative states are getting hit in the US with the Delta variant. I don't know how much you guys in Europe, I'm sure we must have a few listening. I don't know how much you guys in Europe have been following the COVID drama in the United States, but in general, the more left-leaning states have less vaccine hesitancy. And they haven't really been getting hit nearly as hard by the Delta variant as the conservative states, which are much more vaccine hesitant. And the result has been some weird mental gymnastics by politicians. They've been kind of trying to have their cake and eat it too by telling people that the virus isn't that serious, you don't really need a vaccine. But now they're having to kind of turn around and say, well, actually, maybe you do need the vaccine. It's kind of a good idea, but it's still all bullshit. It's this weird kabuki dance they're doing to try to maintain their credibility while also trying to deal with a major public health crisis.
It is the major talking point right now. So a lot of times as a politician, like that's what's on people's minds. So if they can, with confidence, get people's feelings going about a topic, then yeah, that's going to drive votes and engagement. And engagement is a big thing that people are looking for in general. Like you have to fight really hard for visibility on the internet. And we've talked before about how articles get maybe an origin in a very legitimate scholarly study that was done. And they discovered something real, but in a very niche and small scale department where you got a decent start at maybe developing hypothesis, and then this will get completely and totally blown out of proportion in the BuzzFeed article, not to shit on BuzzFeed per se, but some place that isn't the greatest place of like expert scientific knowledge. And they give it a really clickbaity title that scientists just made a black hole and they're going to destroy the universe. And then it kind of gets out of control from there. Yeah. So another thing too, it was mentioned in the chat that, well, it's exploding low IQ voters. I think that high IQ people can be exploited as well, because a lot of people, they aren't using their greatest critical thinking skills all the time. Like maybe they're a person who's really good in their field. They're actually pretty noob in every other field. That's just how expertise works. Like you can't spec into everything at the same time. So you'll have people who are otherwise very capable and smart people suspending that critical thinking because they're not at work. I'm not at work. I don't need to like read the boring stuff. I'm going to read the zesty stuff and kind of meme with everybody else about what the hot button items are. And I think everyone, to an extent, considers themselves a viable expert in religion and politics, just because everyone has their political decisions to make and everyone has their spiritual orientation to decide.
Well said. Yeah, I would point out, just as a side note, that not everybody who does not want to get a vaccine or has not had a vaccine is necessarily doing so because they're either ignorant or because they're not using their full, critical faculties. In some cases, it's risk preferences. Mm-hmm. So some people who are really risk averse are not comfortable with taking a vaccine that has been developed so quickly or that is often using new technology. The mRNA technology behind the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines is pretty new. It hasn't really been used widely used before the pandemic. Mm-hmm. So there are some people who are extremely risk averse who are kind of focused on that. And then there are people who are very risk tolerant who don't really care about the risk inherent in getting COVID-19. And so for them, it's not that big a deal.
Yeah, I have family members who are very risk tolerant. They have the position where they would rather get sick and get it over with than to take a vaccine that they don't fully understand.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's another factor at play. And I would also point out that not everybody who is vaccine hesitant is on the political right. There's also a lot of people on the political left. The African American community is disproportionately vaccine hesitant, for example. There are different reasons for that, but that's one example. And then there's also a lot of white people on the political left who are vaccine hesitant. Generally, these people are kind of more on the fringe part of the political left. These are more your witches and chakra crystals leftists.
Also,
these kinds of
naturopaths would be against it. It's
naturopaths.
Not naturopath if it's not from the earth. Like if you can't articulate what plant or or whatever this thing came from, it's kind of questionable because the naturopaths are really skeptical of the medical industry as a whole. So if the medical industry comes up with something, their first question is, oh, how they're exploiting this for profit, which is a legit question because in the US, like, we have for-profit hospitals and that kind of thing. And a lot of times they'll set prices for medicine for profit rather than just, we're trying to save the world with this. It's like, we're trying to save the world and I've got to make a yacht payment. I want to give people a reasonable price, but the yacht's not gonna pay for itself, you know? So yeah, that's another demographic that can sometimes be on the left. Naturopathy is really big up here in Seattle. You want to be green and from the earth and that kind of stuff. So people would often prefer a weaker, quote, medicine or potential remedy that they can articulate or they could find in the forest near them than something that might be in clinical trials more effective, but they don't understand exactly how it works. So they'll be skeptical and err on the side of perceived caution for them.
Interesting. I'd never heard of that before. It makes total sense, but I just never heard of naturopaths.
You've
before.
probably heard of traditional Chinese medicine. I would say it has a similar vibe to that.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Where it's trying to go with the old recipes of stuff, and tradition is good. It's kind of a mantra there.
Is it traditional, though, or do they have, like, new age potions and stuff like that they're doing?
I would say it's more traditional from the stuff that I've encountered, where they would prefer to find some old remedy that people had used before rather than like a home brew, try to make your own potion practice.
Gotcha. Fair enough.
Maybe Chat knows better about that, but that's been my
Chinese traditional medicine has a whole bunch of politics around it in China. There's a whole policy history there. But yeah, I suspect it's a little bit different in that regard, but it's interesting that they focus on traditional remedies. Oh, another thing about COVID, because Delta is the new thing, there's been talk about booster shots. You know, the idea being that you adjust vaccines to inoculate people against the new variant, you know, the Delta variant in this case. And so there's some desire to produce booster shots for people so that the Delta variant is not as deadly. But there's been a bunch of criticism internationally about that. Because if you're producing booster shots, then some of that, then you're using up production capacity in factories that could be producing shots just for everybody, you know, just basic baseline shots that could be distributed to the developing world, which up till now has not really been vaccinated to any significant degree whatsoever. So it kind of feels in the developing world like the US and the developed world don't really care about them and that they're hoarding vaccines and taking vaccines out of their arms, so to speak, by focusing on booster shots. They would rather that the developed world, you know, spend more money to send more vaccines over to the developing world so that they can kind of catch up a little bit in that regard. But of course, the developing world doesn't have a lot of leverage to use, so probably we're going to end up doing it anyway. There's not a whole lot they can do about it, so that's kind of what I suspect will happen, but they're going to complain a lot while it's happening, so you can look forward to that. Yeah, for those who don't know, the big international vaccination campaign is called COVAX. I think that's sponsored by the UN, and basically the idea is that countries can send vaccines, you know, donate them, or they can send money with which the COVAX program can buy vaccines. And the idea is that the COVAX program can be a way for poor countries who don't have the best, who don't have a lot of money, or maybe who don't have the necessary industry to produce their own vaccines, to get vaccines they would not otherwise be able to get, and to distribute them more equitably than would be the case if we were strictly distributing them based off of demand, you know, and purchasing power. So that program, unsurprisingly, has not been very successful because a lot of countries have been very insular in focusing on vaccinating their population before allowing significant exports to other countries. The United States is sort of the standout example there.
Europe to a lesser degree, and India had been really good about it actually in 2020. Again, that's partly because the virus didn't hit them as hard as expected in 2020. But in 2021, they got hammered, and so they've actually since severely restricted the export of vaccines and vaccine supplies. So now they actually are, doing the same thing as the US and Europe in that regard. So, unfortunately, vaccine nationalism is a very real thing, and it probably will continue to be so, especially in the US. I think in the US, the problem is that the Biden administration doesn't want to be seen as putting other countries' interests above those of the United States. That was one of the things that contributed to the rise of Trump. So I think out of concern for being seen as not sufficiently focused on US parochial interests, he's going to go with the vaccine nationalist approach to vaccination rather than a more broad-based international approach. He has done some things as far as the international approach. He has donated a bunch of vaccines to the COVAX program, and there's been a lot of bilateral vaccine deals. I think South Korea in particular was an example of that. But beyond that, I think he's just too paranoid about the political threat from his right, from the Trumpists, to really be overly focused on the international aspect here. So probably he's going to continue to focus on vaccinating Americans first. I know it's a little ironic since the people, the people who would criticize him for not putting America first are also the people who are more vaccine hesitant. I recognize that sort of discontinuity, that sort of contradiction. But all the same, if we've learned nothing else from the past year and change, it's that people don't feel particularly compelled to be consistent in their criticisms and beliefs. So if you think that vaccine hesitant people won't criticize Biden for not putting America first in terms of vaccinations, then I would just casually point to everything that's happened for the past year as my evidence. It doesn't have to be rational. Anything that they can criticize Biden on will probably be used. So there you go. That's what you can look forward to. I don't think it'll come to that, though, again, because Biden probably will put America first, specifically to avoid that. But I think that is a genuine concern on his part, and I don't think he's wrong for worrying about it.
Yeah, well, he was basically voted in as a more or less compromised candidate, where he's closer to the middle than Trump is. So a lot of the moderates would go with him, and he's not really on a leftist crusade like some people perceive Bernie Sanders to be on. I don't think he would call himself a socialist. A lot of those things that are like very severely left, he would distance himself from. But that doesn't mean that the right doesn't want to like have him be the opposition, because he's not on the right relative to them. So
no, he tries to walk the middle ground, but the middle ground in America has gotten so thin that that's a tightrope. So that's a hard ground to walk.
Why would you take the middle ground? Don't you have
it.
principles? Don't you have passion? How could you be a centrist?
Yeah, well, Griller's gonna grill, Neuro.
Yeah. I am kind of curious just to see if there was a way to study like a cross-sectional look at how radical or moderate the average American citizen is, because the media that we consume very heavily favors people with more extreme views rather than people with more boring views. Like if it's boring, then people aren't going to click on whatever the page is. So I wonder how many people are in their homes just kind of chill and just seeing people yelling and kind of like, what?
Most of them.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that there has not been a shift towards the wings of the political spectrum. It's actually a really nice... There's a subreddit called Data is Beautiful. They've got lots of cool infographics, and one of them is an older one that I've actually seen before, but I saw it again the past week. It was a infographic that showed the shift in political views over time in the United States. I forget what the exact methodology was, but basically they looked at how much congressmen were working together and where they were on the political spectrum. And you can see over time that they were working together less and less, and that more and more of them were further away from the center of the political spectrum, to the point where you basically have now two spheres representing the two political perspectives on opposite sides of a gap in the middle. Whereas before they'd been much more integrated, and they were a lot more, it was basically just one sphere.
just sort of clumped together. But now you can see very distinctly two different spheres in that data.
Well,
So
now
that
it's seen as bad if you're purple. Like if you're willing to vote sometimes with the Republicans and sometimes with the Democrats, well, you're a weak party member, and we don't
Yeah.
really like you very much. So it's seen as a bad thing, rather than in certain periods where you place more of an emphasis on skepticism and updating your thinking. So for someone to do a swing vote, that would be seen as a courageous thing. And there are some people who will still see it that way. But yeah, if you want to build clout with your own party, you don't vote against whatever their initiative is. It doesn't look good for you.
Yeah. Unfortunately so. But yeah, that is, one of the defining dynamics of American politics and modern history. Just that continuing exacerbation of political differences, the widening gap between the two perspectives. Let's see, we did have a follow-up Haiti question. Somebody was asking about aid. Have I heard anything about the funds sent to Haiti and their effectiveness the last time they were ravaged by an earthquake? I've been reading for years that so much of the money sent there was wasted or never used properly. I really don't know because I didn't really follow that story very closely after the fact. I read about it when it happened, and I actually had somebody I know deployed there. There's a guy in the National Guard who had to kind of go and help out since the U.S. military was deployed to provide emergency relief. But beyond that, I didn't really track how the aid money was being spent. It really would not surprise me in the least, though, to find out that a lot of it ended up getting wasted. It's, if you're sending something like food, then you can generally buy that in the United States or whatever, and then you can send it overseas. And then the problem is distribution. Maybe it gets to the people it needs to, or maybe it gets stolen and sold on the black market. But with something like construction, it's a lot harder because with construction, you're generally using local workers, local contractors, local suppliers. And in a poor country with weak rule of law like Haiti, it's kind of difficult to navigate that stuff without getting mired in corruption. People will inflate prices, they'll steal money from you, blah, blah, blah. It's a whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
So reconstruction is pretty difficult in that regard in a country like Haiti. So it wouldn't surprise me to find out that a lot of the money ended up getting wasted for that reason. But I would have to do more reading to be able to comment intelligently about it because I really don't know how exactly that played out. So I would have to punt on that question.
Well, anyone would hope that they wasted less money than the Afghan government.
Not a high bar.
No.
Although, if anybody's good at not clearing low bars, it would be Haiti. So, who's to say? Let's see what we got. With respect to African nations, intra-conflict, and the UN interventions, are the Blue Helmets doing something? So basically, are UN interventions effective at peacekeeping in Africa? Kind of. The trouble with peacekeeping interventions is that the state you're deploying to basically has to give you permission to come there. And if they don't want it, then you can't go. And that kind of puts a limit on how effective UN interventions can really be. If the government is oppressing people and there's a legitimate rebellion, you're not going to get a UN deployment there, most likely, unless there's a lot of pressure to bear or something. On the other hand, if the rebels are doing really well, then the government is going to be a lot more receptive to requests for the deployment of a UN intervention force. So in that case, much more likely. But then what that means is that you're a lot more likely to get UN deployments in places where things are just really, really unstable. You're not likely to get them in cases where the state is stable but just very violent. And the trouble with deploying military force in a really unstable region, especially a force that's tied down with a lot of rules of engagement, is you can't really do a lot. If you destroy one of the factions, then you can have an effect, but the UN can't do that. Their whole job is just to prevent fighting, and that's about it. So that puts a cap on how useful they can be. Now, that doesn't mean that it can't play a useful role. They can. But generally, their role is in providing room for negotiation. There'll be some critical objective or some strategic piece of land that the UN can occupy so that they're not fighting over it, and so that creates a little bit of negotiating space. so that the different factions can come together and reach some kind of deal. So it's useful, but it's not as useful as people would like it to be. I feel like people judge the UN too harshly because they have such high expectations of it. They hear about peacekeeping missions and they, hear about the UN and they think, oh, okay, well, the UN must be really good at this. It must be a really useful institution that can stop civil wars and international conflicts and whatnot. And it's not. It's not meant to be a panacea for international conflict. It's just meant to act as an inhibitor. It mitigates how severe crises and conflicts are, and it mitigates the likelihood of conflicts emerging in the first place. But that's it. It could do more, but then in order to do that, you would have to get permission from UN members to increase the scope and mandate of UN interventions, and that ain't going to happen because just like the United States, governments around the world are super, super concerned about sovereignty, and they're not going to give that up easily. So in all likelihood, the UN is probably permanently capped in how useful UN interventions can be. Again, doesn't mean they're not useful and that we shouldn't still support them, but people need to probably lower their expectations a little about what the UN is meant to do and what it does.
So you're saying it's not a combat-oriented organization as its primary purpose?
Correct.
Oh.
Yeah, it's just not meant for that. It's more, unsurprisingly, it's mostly meant to be a diplomatic and mediating institution. It's meant to be the talking shop of talking shops, so to speak. What about the closure of schools in the southern U.S. after hundreds of students and teachers have been infected? How will this affect the school years of both children and of the teachers, with students missing significant portion of the year and teachers losing pay? And also, how we're facing a teaching crisis with fewer and fewer educators being available, be it from health-related issues or from refusing to put themselves in these situations. The question kind of answers itself. The fact that schools are shutting down means more children are going to be missing out on education, even if they try to do it online. Online teaching is meh. That seems to be the consensus of people I've talked to about it. It's just very meh. It's doable, but it's not preferable. So that's what's going to happen in the South. It just kind of seems inevitable at this point, although they could still go. We're talking about a region of the U.S. where people are very conservative and are very sort of risk tolerant as far as how they deal with the virus. So they may well end up opening those schools anyway and having class, just depending on how things go. We'll see. We'll see. As far as the teaching crisis aspect, I don't know as much about that. I don't have a strong background in education research such that I could comment authoritatively on that. I wouldn't be surprised if the South had more of a problem getting teachers because they probably don't pay them as well. Not for political reasons, or at least not just for political reasons, but also because the South is just much poorer. So they can't really afford to spend as much on education. But also, I suspect a lot of people leave just because the conditions aren't as good or favorable for teachers. So that's also another factor.
One of the other questions to consider too is how much do you value teaching as a profession? Because a lot of the information that a teacher is meant to convey to, say, grade school kids is technically very simple, but the art of raising children and keeping track of them and making sure they grow up into good people, that's a really difficult task. So if you think about it in that term, you should pay teachers more so they raise better children, because when the parents are at work and they send them off to school, it's the teachers who are the stewards of the children. So you don't really want to send people who you don't think are very smart or very good into the teaching field. You want legit people with skills and also who are good managers of children.
Ideally. But yeah, I'm not familiar enough with the labor shortage, I guess, in the industry to really know what the major determinants are or just how much COVID will affect them. In general, I would expect that COVID would mean fewer people would want to become teachers and that it'll probably exacerbate the shortage in so much as there is one. But I don't know how significant that will be, so I can't comment too much on that.
Pay teachers more. There's your propaganda for the segment.
Let's see. You probably want to go to bed, don't you?
I just queued for a game, so 15 minutes.
Oh, okay. That'll work.
I just
The
queued
next
into a mech
question
tear in 20
was,
minutes.
Sorry, what?
I just queued into a mech Terran player. It's actually 20 minutes. It'll be a bit longer.
Oh, is that are those the ones who do the turtling? Is that what it's called?
Yes, tanks. Thors,
Gotcha.
planetary sitting at home.
Oh, I used to like doing that when I played StarCraft back in the day. Just
Someone
fun style
asked,
for me, I guess.
there's an Agent Smith on the ladder somewhere. Someone asked if that was you.
Nope. Oh, I've never played multiplayer StarCraft. Way too competitive for my blood. I liked single player. I did some of the co-op for a while, but yeah, mostly single player for me. Let's see. So the next question was fake news and post-truth, how democratic countries are dealing with that. Mostly they're not. I mean, it's just really difficult to deal with it because there are so many protections for free speech in Western countries. So that just makes it a really difficult Gordian knot for policymakers. You know, you could create like really restrictive rules for what can be posted online, but then, you know, that violates people's right to free expression. You can create like an oversight institution, like a committee or an agency or whatever, to oversee what's being, you know, censored and what's not, to make sure everything is kosher. But then that just turns into a perennial political battle about who controls the agency and what kinds of inherent biases are innate in the censorship that they're overseeing or, you know, judging. And then, of course, if you just take a laissez-faire approach, then you end up with what we have now, which also comes with its own problems. So good luck dealing with that. You know, that just kind of comes down really to building a political consensus as to the best way, or at least the best approach to regulating online social media. And that more than anything would help, you know, because at least then you could have a commonly accepted set of standards that everyone supports.
Basically, the way that I would put it is the internet could have been structured in a way where accuracy voted things to the top, when in reality it's dankness that puts things at the top. It is. Well, I mean, like how much it makes you feel, like how intense and interesting it is. Not necessarily what's true, what's dank.
I mean, that's always been the nature of the internet, isn't it? You know, it's always been about kind of filtering in the most interesting, novel, unusual content. And so we've kind of, I mean, that's the way it was from the start, but we've also conditioned people over time to kind of engage in that way. I don't know that I would have it any other way, but obviously, as you point out, it comes with some unfortunate side effects. But yeah, I mean, other than that, the only other approach to it is like an authoritarian approach, you know, like the Great Wall, or not the Great Wall.
The Chinese firewall?
What am I thinking of?
The firewall in China?
Thank you. Brain didn't want to work on that one. Yeah, the Great Firewall.
They also have a Great Wall, but that's a brick physical wall.
Yeah.
Or stone, whatever they used.
Yeah, China totally insulates its internet from the rest of the world, and they have very strong regulation of what gets posted there. So that is an effective model if you want to restrict the kinds of content that people post. Russia kind of has something like that. It's still relatively open, but they've been kind of shifting more towards stronger regulation in recent years. It's been getting harder to post dissident content over time, you know, unsurprisingly. They've also been bottlenecking the infrastructure so that there are fewer, more easily controllable choke points through which to access the internet, or to stop access to the internet, as the case may be.
They could do pro-government posts, get double upvotes.
They could. I don't think they've done that, to my knowledge, but I guess they could. But yeah, that's also another efficacious model. You know, that's another way you could do it. I don't know how much the Russian government or the Chinese government is focused on the kinds of social ills that people who advocate for greater regulation of social media have in mind when they think of regulation. But you know, irregardless, they could still do that. You know, that is an approach that could be co-opted and utilized by a Western government. It would be very controversial, but you could do it, technically. But beyond that, I don't know how else you could even really address the problem. I mean, you could make it like a crime to post certain kinds of lies on the internet, but that would probably not be very effective. You know, people can dodge justice basically on the internet very easily. I think one of the things I read is something like the vast majority, like 90% maybe, of vaccine misinformation on the internet comes from something like 24 people, maybe even fewer than that. It's a very small number. You know, so modern technology, you know, the internet, social media is a great force multiplier. You don't need a whole lot of people to spread a lot of misinformation. You know, what's unusual about anti-vaccine misinformation is not that it exists. You can expect misinformation of all kinds. What's unusual about it is the uptake, you know, just the degree to which it's been embraced by people. And I don't think that's because of the misinformation on its own merits. I don't think, you know, people see it and think, oh, wow, that really changed my mind. That really changed my perspective regarding how I think about vaccines. I don't think it works like that. I think just people who had pre-existing biases kind of integrate ideas that they get from misinformation in order to try to bolster their position.
One of the really strong forces that we have is confirmation bias, and how a lot of it ends up being which team are you on, and the teams tend to just kind of decide together on topics without necessarily every single person thinking them through. It's like, okay, my team is going with this one, so I'm going to go with this one. And then another kind of headline I saw was that there were some trolls who were trying to get people to be a lot more divisive with their just posts and talk regarding the vaccine and restrictions. And that's been one of the things used against us, and I think the election as well, which is just trying to make a bunch of distracting and or negative posts to incite fights between Americans.
Yep, that's a good summary. Yeah, it's not necessarily sort of the cat stroking supervillain trying to manipulate outcomes. You know, a lot of it is just sort of low risk, low reward effort. You know, it's cheap and easy to produce misinformation. It's not likely to have a big effect, but in so much as it does, it can be worth doing, so long as it's cheaper than the cost.
It's cheaper than flying planes around.
Oh yeah, much more so. But it were otherwise. Let's see. So that's not a great answer to the question. You know, that's really a deep question in which you could get into all kinds of, you know, legal and philosophical and political aspects. But, you know, just in general, there hasn't been a lot done about it thus far, and mostly it doesn't look like it's going to be something we do much about anytime soon. There's just not enough consensus on how to address the problem. Let's see. So the last one we had here, are you familiar with the info linking severe COVID reactions to hyperinsulinemia, insulin resistance? I've spent years helping people eliminate their insulin resistance, so it's kind of a hot topic for me, being able to actually save lives by doing so. I know nothing about this topic. I don't know anything about insulin resistance, or the pancreas. You know, the article I read about COVID impacting the pancreas disproportionately did not go into the science of it. They just mentioned that in India there had been a sharp intake of diabetics, partly because of COVID. So beyond that, I really don't know anything about what kind of links COVID would have with insulin resistance. Yeah, if you've got some links for me, that would be appreciated. Then I can learn more about it. But yeah, beyond that, I really can't comment intelligently about it. Maybe this could be another good question for
Will Blair.
Will Blair. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, he would probably know much more about this than I would. But yeah, otherwise I would have to punt on it. Let's see, that's all we had. How are you doing in your match?
I may be able to just go fight them now.
Best of luck.
Thanks. Well, thanks for helping tackle Afghanistan kind of as the action is developing.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, I've been taking notes on it, so it's glad to be able to put that to good use. I mean, obviously everybody's kind of following it right now. So I mean,
Hmm.
I don't know how much I can really add as far as like current events, but hopefully I was able to add some context for people. That's kind of the best I can do at this point.
Hmm.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens with Afghanistan under the Taliban again. I don't really know what kind of foreign policy they're going to have. Obviously, everybody in the region has good reason to try to deal with them directly, but there's also some real contradictions there in doing so. So we'll see how those get resolved or not, as the case may be. I hope that we had somebody who commented on one of our YouTube videos a while ago about the vaccine nationalism. And I still have the notes I took to answer that guy. I just haven't been able to get back to that topic in a long time. It's been months. He's probably forgotten all about it by now, but technically that is a thing that I've got in the cards here. Maybe I should just put that on the SoundCloud. That might be the better way to do it, because it'll probably take a while to get through all of it. I wish SoundCloud has comments though, so people could post. I just
Hmm.
haven't seen very many on there. It's what I like about YouTube. You get a lot of feedback, or at least relatively more.
Yeah, I think a lot of that has to do with YouTube comments are very often engaged with. With like SoundCloud comments, I don't think that section is nearly as active in terms of your participation.
Yeah. Let's see, there's been some stuff with Iran, but I don't have like a whole lot on it. Basically, there's just this. We talked about the shadow war between Israel and Iran before, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So that's ongoing and it's been escalating. There was another ship that was attacked, probably by the Iranians. That was a little awkward for them. They flew an armed drone, a suicide drone, basically, into this merchant ship of some kind. I think it was a container ship or an oil rig, oil ship of some kind. But when they flew the drone into the ship, they flew it into the bridge and they actually killed some of the crew, which was a problem because some of them were from Western countries. So that puts Western governments in a position where they kind of have to do something. Specifically, I think he was British. I think the Westerner who was killed was British. So the British government has kind of been putting pressure on the Iranian government about that. Probably, I would assume, not what the Iranians wanted to do. Better just to do some damage. Once you start killing people, that kind of escalates things to a point that you're maybe not going to be comfortable with.
Yeah, I think to quote Sun Tzu, the supreme art of war is to win and defeat the enemy without fighting. So if you can
Yeah.
establish dominance in the region without bloodshed, that would be the best play. Because you say, no, we control this, you can't mess with us, but at the same time, we didn't create a reason for you to seek vengeance. Property damage is a bummer, but people aren't as rustled about property as people.
Yeah, they are pretty much trying to do that. That is to say, take over the region without necessarily fighting a big war for it. That's why they keep supporting all these proxy groups, like the Houthis in Yemen or the militias in Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Syrian government. These are all sort of part of their axis of resistance, as they call it. But I don't know if it's going to be enough. The U.S. is pretty powerful. And since we're pulling out of Afghanistan, that means we don't have as many assets tied down there. So that kind of frees us up to be a little more flexible in other regions. I guess it also means the Iranians don't have to be as worried about their eastern flank. So maybe that's an offset there. But in general, I think the U.S. kind of got the better end of that deal.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not great that we're leaving Afghanistan in the state that it's in. That's unfortunate. But strategically speaking, it's not a backbreaker. You know, I mean, Afghanistan as a conflict was just so marginal in the United States. Hardly anybody paid attention to it for the longest time. I think I saw on Reddit some people were saying, well, I don't really know how to feel about this, but they kind of do, really. Because really, most people haven't really cared that much.
Unless you like fought there or know somebody who fought there or have some other direct tie to the country. The vast majority of Americans aren't like that, and their attitude has just been very blasé about Afghanistan for years.
It's
I
very
really,
far away from us.
sorry,
It's very far away. I
yeah,
think it's almost smack dab on the opposite side of the earth from us.
oh yeah, and I kind of knew people didn't really care about it because there was a big leak of a report done by the U.S. government that actually it may not have even been a leak. I think maybe they just released it, but it was a review of the war in Afghanistan, and what they found is a lot of corruption, a lot of inefficiency. It just really kind of revealed the war to be inefficacious, if that's even a word, just really deeply critiqued the American effort there. And the response was pretty mild. The US public wasn't really that interested. So I think even though the US spent a lot of money in Afghanistan, and even though people were fighting and dying there, the US public was just not on board with it. You know, they were on board with it like the first year or two when they were fighting, Al Qaeda and the Taliban. But after that, interest kind of fell out pretty quickly. And,
Well, what we talked about before Agent Smith today was how after 9/11, a lot of American sentiment was we need to play back at whoever did this.
yeah,
So Afghanistan and Iraq were part of that general decision for consensus between the Republicans and the Democrats to go and intervene and like do stuff over there. Was it accurate to where we received damage? Not really. We got embroiled in a couple different situations that had been existing for a while, and then now we're kind of seeing the snapback in the region after we left. So there was the snapback in Iraq first, and then now in Afghanistan. So we're going to see what is the steady state of Afghanistan going to look like. Are they going to
yeah.
pursue legit governance and statehood? Maybe. Are they more fighters and they don't actually know how to lead? Maybe. It seemed like one of the things you mentioned was we pulled out kind of like a thief in the night where we didn't give them a bunch of prep and notice and say, okay, we're leaving. This is how you need to do things. These will be your priorities, and make sure the ship is in decent shape before you go. It's just like, nope, we're out.
Yeah, I think that was a Biden thing
Mm,
because that's kind of what he wanted to do back when he was vice president under Obama. So now that he's president, he's kind of been able to get his preferred policy preference on that.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, his perspective on it is probably that if you stay in Afghanistan, you're just pouring, good money after bad. It's just it's not going to get you any return. It's not going to make much of an impact, and you're just going to have to leave sooner or later. I
Yeah.
think if the US had planned it better, I think a better way to do it would have been to try to ally with some of the local warlords, or maybe not ally with them even, maybe just support them, give them weapons, money, on the condition that they fight the Taliban or at least keep the Taliban in line to some degree.
Yeah.
That probably would have been more effective, but the trouble with doing that is that a lot of those people are drug dealers. A lot of those people abuse the local population. They're not popular. It would have been a bad look internationally. It would have involved violating human rights. It just would have gone against the whole program of U.S. involvement in Afghanistan. Other than fighting terrorism and, making sure Al Qaeda didn't come back, the other justification is that we're helping them. We're building a modern state, building a modern society, blah, blah, blah. So making all the moral compromises necessary to have an effective military policy in Afghanistan would have been politically unviable and probably is even now. So I think Biden is not wrong in doing what he did, just leaving. The kind of stuff you would have had to have done in order to make it work would have been very unpalatable for most Americans, I suspect.
Yeah, I would say just from like a strategic military honor standpoint, you would want some defenses that you had for a while to last for at least a little bit, generally. So being able to instruct the local population, but as you mentioned, there was a bunch of corruption just in military operations overall. So they don't really have a great passion and motivation to do it how the Americans would want. They're Afghan citizens, so they want to live Afghan lives, not American lives.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually on that note, I just want to add something else. I've heard some people say that Afghans are not willing to fight for their country, and that that was one of the reasons why the Afghan army fell apart. And that's not true. Afghans are actually very patriotic. They're more than happy and more than willing and more than capable for their country. What they're not willing to fight for is the Afghan state, which again, they don't particularly like or respect, especially over the past couple decades. So
Mm.
the Afghan state, in whatever form it takes, is not something that they're all that interested in fighting and dying for. But if it's their country, that they will do and have done repeatedly.
Yeah, religion also is a powerful motivator too. That in many societies, I think religion is weighed as more important than the state. You have like the polar opposite in China, where the state is the most important. North Korea, like the state is the ultimate. Where for some people, they say that God's ways are higher than human ways, so His laws are higher than human laws. So they would favor religion over the state. So yeah, the Afghan state wouldn't be something that they have a long-standing, really strong feeling of loyalty toward. It's like a recently propped up name for them, not something with a long-standing history.
Yeah, exactly. You know, people are a lot more loyal to their locality, their local clan, their families than they are to any national institutions in Afghanistan. But they will fight against a foreign invader. They've done that quite a bit.
You've used the word hawkish and dovish. We would say that Biden is dovish. He hasn't really
That's
pushed us forward in
that's
any capacity.
well, sorry, what?
He hasn't pushed us forward militarily toward anything, has he?
That's a really tricky question.
Right. There are a bunch of forces around him and moving under him during his administration that aren't really his decisions. So it might be saying too much. It seems
Well,
it was more of a
that's
preferences question. Are his preferences to play more defensive and safe?
well, I think yeah, in general he's more defensive, he's more dovish in the sense that he's more strategically reserved.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but that doesn't necessarily mean he doesn't have hawkish elements to his foreign policy. I mean, just by dint of his being like a middle of the road centrist, he kind of has to be reserved, right? That's sort of his whole political persona, as it were. But part of the political wins in the United States is that politics has been getting more populist. And on the one hand, that means less foreign interventionism, but it also means being tougher on those areas of foreign policy on which there's more consensus for intervention.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, I don't think anybody in the US really wants Iran to have a nuclear weapon. That's kind of a consensus issue. The problem is how you go about making sure it doesn't happen. You know, how do you operationalize that policy in practice?
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, for Biden in general, he may want to be more reserved on that, but in practice, he's actually largely followed the Trump approach. He's not doing the maximum pressure campaign. You know, he's not just laying on sanctions pressure for the sake of it, and he has been much more forthright and forthcoming and trying to organize negotiations. But in general, he hasn't really changed much. He has, you know, technically the US still has the same degree of sanctions targeting Iran that it had under Trump. And, you know, while Biden would prefer to have a deal and, you know, relax the sanctions and would be happy to do so, the Iranian government hasn't been willing to reciprocate. And so long as that's the case, I suspect that the Biden administration will continue to have a relatively hawkish policy as far as Iran. So more support for Israel and the shadow war against Iran, probably a continued naval presence in the region, if perhaps an overall, you know, lowering, an overall drawdown of U.S. forces in the region, probably to reorient towards East Asia. But I suspect naval assets will probably increase just so that the United States can continue to pressure Iran as far as the nuclear program and sundry other, you know, proxy wars that are being fought in the region.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, he's more hawkish, and I think that's just part of that relative shift towards populism in the American, you know, in American politics. You know, I think he's a savvy politician. I think he's a smart guy politically. I think he senses that, and you can kind of see that. It's like what I was talking about before with vaccine nationalism, like being
a liberal leftist, you would think he would be more international in outlook and would try to cooperate with other countries more. But I think he senses the populist moment in American politics and wants to focus more on the United States for that reason. So that's just another example of that shift towards populism. So in foreign policy, in some areas like Iran, he's going to be more hawkish, and he's going to try to project strength overseas as best he can. But in a case like Afghanistan, the populist sentiment is that the US shouldn't be there and that we should just leave. And I suspect that's also part of the calculation the administration made as far as how the US should withdraw. Yes, we could have done more to plan the withdrawal better. Yes, we could have propped up some proxies in country, but the public wouldn't have liked it. It would not have been politically palatable. People just wanted to leave. And so Biden has basically given the public what it wants. And, in doing so, it's probably going to diffuse some populist pressure. Some of that populist pressure that's been building up over time in American politics. So that is useful. That is going to have utility, even if it comes at an immense human cost in Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm. So I think there's a difference here between projecting power, as in being in a region and making sure people don't do stuff, versus applying power, which is when human lives are fighting with guns on the front line. And you're like militarily in there. So he's doing the projecting, but he's not doing the direct fighting as much.
Yeah.
And it also sounds like you're saying he's shooting for the middle in terms of what America wants, rather than shooting from maybe what would be his vision. Because he's got to work with the right now. And that's the really tough task of being a leader, is if you have one position at the top, so the executive is the position probably with the most total power, you have to work with the right half of America. It's not just pure halves, but you have to work with them to make progress forward. Like basically to win votes, you need over 50%. So trying to sway the middle and be able to reach a consensus. I was thinking about what are some things that we should all have a consensus on, regardless of whether you're conservative or progressive or libertarian or whatever. Clean water. I think that's a good priority that we could emphasize. These heckin' fires that we've been having, can we not make a fleet of planes to put out the fires like super fast? Can't you get air forces for that? That would be badass. That would be a very America thing to do too. So yeah, I think as a person, it's good to be aware of, is there drama that's being drummed up here? Is this something that's worth focusing on for me? Because you can find people mad about every topic.
Oh yeah.
Pretty much.
Easily.
What should we focus on now? I think for a lot of us, this was a weird year for climate and weather. So we had unusual heat spikes here in Seattle. I have to get an air conditioner for next summer. It will probably be as bad, maybe worse. So that's a thing. And then just finding more moderation and I guess value of skepticism and listening. There are a lot of people who talk a whole bunch, and it's more about the faith in your and strength in your convictions. But being wrong is a really refreshing feeling, because you have that initial point where you want to win the discussion. A lot of people feel this, like, I want to be right about this. If they correct you and they present a good argument and evidence, even if they're from a different political party than you, you can now be less wrong for the rest of your life. And that's amazing.
I concur.
Be prepared to be wrong about stuff. Well, cool. Thanks for coming on for Agent Smith. Spicy day.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's always a privilege. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Moss, for handling questions. And if you have any questions in the YouTube comments, feel free to put those in this video and we can address them on the next episode. 20-minute walk, dude. I challenge you again.
Gonna try for the 20-minute-er. Okay.
Yep, and
maybe
chat.
I can walk around the block twice. That'll probably get me to 20.
You're all challenged as well. 20-minute walk. Try to get on your feet.
Pray that I don't have any human interaction.
Okay. I will pray that it will be surprisingly quiet that day.
Here's hoping. Yeah, I'll try my best. But thank you, man. I always appreciate it.
Appreciate you,
Talk
sir.
to you next time.
Have a good night. And that has been World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith. Smith.